The wagon driver didn't slow down. He didn't even look back. He just snapped the reins, and the horses lurched forward through the gray Colorado morning, leaving Evelyn Hart standing alone on a road that was already disappearing under fresh snow. Her trunk sat in the mud behind her, dumped, not set down, and the driver's parting words still hung in the frozen air like something rotten. End of the line for charity cases. She hadn't asked for charity. She had paid for passage. Every cent she had left in the world, folded into that man's thick palm 3 days ago in Denver. But he'd decided somewhere along the way that a woman traveling alone in winter, with a battered trunk and no husband waiting, wasn't worth the extra miles. So he stopped, and left her 9 miles from anywhere, in the middle of a snowstorm that was building fast and mean out of the mountains to the west. Evelyn stood there for a long moment, the wind cutting through her coat like it wasn't even there. She looked at the road ahead. She looked at the road behind. Then she picked up her trunk by its broken handle, set her jaw, and started walking. If this story is already pulling you in, you're in the right place. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. And drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that road. The trunk lasted about a mile. The handle gave out completely on a patch of ice, and Evelyn stood over it, breathing hard, hands already aching from the cold, and made a calculation she didn't want to make. The trunk held everything she owned in the world: 3 dresses, 2 books, a pair of good leather gloves she'd saved up 2 months for, and a small tintype photograph of her mother. She opened it, pulled out the photograph, the gloves, and the warmest of the 3 dresses, which she pulled over the dress she was already wearing right there on the road, not caring how she looked because there was no one to look at her. She folded the gloves carefully into her coat pocket. She left the trunk where it was. She walked. The snow was coming harder now, and what had been a recognizable road was becoming a matter of educated guessing. She could feel the cold working its way into her boots, good boots once, but they'd been resoled twice, and the stitching on the left one was going. Every time her foot came down in the wet snow, she could feel it, that little give, that little seep of icy water. She didn't let herself think about it. She thought about the advertisement instead. She'd read it 3 times in the Denver paper, once at the boarding house kitchen table before Mrs. Harker could take the paper away, and twice more from memory, which was almost better because she could arrange the words the way she wanted them. Blackridge Ranch, Sutter Creek Valley, seeking experienced household manager. Must be capable, organized, and willing to work, fair wages. Inquire at the property. It hadn't said anything about a 2-day journey through a blizzard. But then most things didn't advertise their complications up front. Evelyn had learned that early. She'd been 17 when her father died and left the family, with a mortgaged house and a reputation for debt that spread through their small Indiana town faster than the news of his death. Her mother had lasted 2 more years, long enough to see Evelyn find work as a hotel housekeeper, long enough to say she was proud, not long enough to see what came next. What came next was a decade of trying. Hotel work, then a brief stint as a school teacher in a town that paid so poorly she'd sometimes gone 2 days on cornmeal and nothing else. Then a position managing the household of a merchant family in Kansas City, who let her go when the husband's sister needed the room and the salary. Then Denver, which had seemed like possibility and turned out to be expensive. She was 28 years old. She was walking 9 miles through a Colorado blizzard with a tintype photograph in her coat pocket and the vague, stubborn belief that she was going to be all right. She wasn't entirely sure she believed it, but she kept walking anyway. The feeling left her fingers around mile 4. She'd put on the leather gloves, but the wind was something different. At this elevation, it didn't just blow. It pressed like something heavy, leaning on her from the side, trying to nudge her off the road. She tucked her chin down into her collar and counted her steps when she had to, anything to keep her mind from doing the thing it wanted to do, which was calculate the odds against her. She thought about the ranch instead. She didn't know what Blackridge Ranch looked like. She'd only heard it described once by a Denver shopkeeper who'd mentioned it in passing as one of the big spreads out in Sutter Creek. Big enough to be known. Big enough that someone in Denver had heard of it. That was either good or very bad, because large operations run by wealthy men tended to be careful about who they hired, and careful usually meant suspicious of a woman showing up alone in winter, with no references left standing because her former employers had moved, died, or disbanded. She had letters. She'd written them herself, a fact she had made peace with on purely practical grounds. They were accurate in spirit, if not in strict technical authorship. She really had managed a household of 11 for the merchant family. She really had reorganized their entire supply system and saved them money for 3 straight years. She just hadn't been able to reach them to request formal correspondence in time. The letter said all the true things. She'd worry about the authorship question later if it came up, which she intended to make sure it didn't. Around mile 5, she slipped. The ice was buried under an inch of fresh snow, and she didn't see it until her left foot went sideways and she came down hard on her hands and knees. She stayed there for a moment on the road, cold pressing up through her skirts, hands stinging where the packed snow had scraped them. She could feel the small, specific pain of torn skin on her right palm. She got up. She looked at her hands. Her right palm was bleeding not badly. A surface scrape, but the cold made it sting with an almost insistent clarity. She pressed her palm against her coat for a moment, then put the glove back on. She walked. The Blackridge gate appeared out of the snow like something in a fever dream. Massive timber posts, sunk deep in the earth, a crossbeam overhead with the ranch name burned into it in letters that had been there long enough to weather and settle. The gate itself stood open, which seemed like an oversight but was probably just practicality. You didn't close a working gate in the middle of a ranch day. The main house was visible from the gate, a quarter-mile up a lane that someone had partially shoveled earlier in the day, enough to show the gravel underneath, though the snow was filling it back in. Evelyn walked up the lane. Her feet had stopped hurting about 20 minutes ago, which she knew was not a good sign. She focused on the house. It was large. Not ostentatious, not the kind of large that was built for showing off, but functional large. The kind of large that comes from genuine need and gets added to over years as the need grows. There was a main house of 2 full stories with a covered porch that ran its whole length, and then a connected lower wing that had been added later. You could see the different lumber. There were outbuildings visible through the snow, a long bunkhouse, what looked like 2 barns, a smokehouse, several smaller structures. The whole operation had the settled, permanent look of something that had been built right the first time and maintained seriously since. Evelyn climbed the porch steps. She knocked. She waited. She knocked again, harder. The door opened, and the man on the other side of it looked at her, the way people tend to look at something unexpected that appears on their porch in a blizzard, which is to say, with a complicated expression that combined surprise, assessment, and a certain wariness that wasn't quite unfriendly but wasn't far from it. He was taller than she'd expected. Not in an extraordinary way, but in the way of a man who'd done physical work his whole life, and it had settled into him wide through the shoulders, solid, with a kind of stillness that people sometimes mistake for slowness, but is actually just confidence. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, she'd have guessed, with dark hair that was just starting to silver at the temples, and a jaw that could have used a razor 2 days ago. He wore a heavy flannel shirt, work pants, boots that were good quality and well kept. His hands, resting on the doorframe, were the hands of a working man. Not an office man. Not a gentleman rancher who let other people do the actual labor. He looked at her. She looked at him. A gust of wind pushed snow sideways across the porch between them. "I'm looking for Gideon Blackridge," Evelyn said. "You found him. I'm here about the household manager position." She reached into her coat and produced the folded advertisement, the Denver newspaper clipping, slightly damp from the journey but intact. She held it out. He didn't take it. He was looking at her hands. "You're bleeding," he said. "I'm aware. The position, is it still available? How did you get here?" "I walked from the Sutter Creek Junction." A pause. "The supply wagon left me." Something shifted in his expression, not sympathy exactly, more like recalibration, the look of a man revising his initial read of a situation. "That's 9 miles. I'm aware of that too." She kept the advertisement extended between them. Her arm was starting to shake, though she'd have rather bitten through her own tongue than let him think it was from anything other than cold. "Mr. Blackridge, is the position available or not?" He stepped back from the door. "Come inside." The kitchen was warm in the way that a fire-heated room in a cold house is warm, intense, and immediate, and almost disorienting after what she'd walked through. Evelyn stood just inside the door and let herself absorb it for a moment. A cast-iron stove dominated one wall. A long table ran the center of the room, scarred and practical, the kind of table that had seen 10,000 working meals. Copper pots hung from the ceiling. The whole space smelled of coffee and wood smoke, and she identified it after a moment. Something burned. Something that had been on the stove too long and rescued just before the point of no return. Gideon Blackridge was looking at her hands again. "Sit down," he said, and it wasn't a question. "I'd rather stand." She was calculating whether she could stand without her legs registering an opinion, which she thought she probably could if she distributed her weight correctly. "I'd like to tell you my qualifications before you make a decision about whether to invite me to sit." He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled a chair out from the table himself and sat in it, which left her standing, which felt oddly better, even footing, so to speak. "Go ahead," he said. She talked for 4 minutes. She had rehearsed this part, not scripted it, because scripted things sound scripted, but she'd organized it the way you organize a supply list by category and importance. She told him about the Kansas City household, the staff of 6 she'd managed directly, the 11 household members she'd served, the supply reorganization. She told him she could keep accounts, manage a kitchen staff, coordinate with ranch operations on food and household supply needs, and handle correspondence. She did not tell him about the letters of reference being self-authored. She held that information the way you hold a card you're not sure you'll need to play. Gideon Blackridge listened without interrupting. That was the first thing that surprised her about him. Most men interrupted. Not rudely usually, just they'd interject to confirm something, or to redirect, or simply because the habit of the room being arranged around their responses was so ingrained they didn't notice doing it. He sat with his forearms on his thighs and listened to all 4 minutes of her qualifications without a word. When she finished, there was a brief silence. "You walked 9 miles, he said. In that, he gestured at the window where the storm was doing things that qualified as active and hostile. "I did." "Why didn't you turn back?" It was a genuine question. She could hear it, not a test, not a challenge, actual curiosity about the decision-making of a person who had made a choice he wouldn't have predicted. "Because turning back would have required me to walk 9 miles in the opposite direction," she said, "to a town with no work and a boarding house I couldn't afford for more than another week." Forward seemed more practical. He was quiet for a moment. "I'll be honest with you. I've had 3 household managers in the last 2 years. First one lasted a month. Second one lasted 6 weeks. Third one was here until September. What happened to them? First 2 couldn't handle the isolation." He paused. "Third one got married. To one of my ranch hands." Another pause, and something crossed his face that might have been the ghost of amusement, that created its own complications. "I'm not looking to marry anyone," Evelyn said flatly. "I'm looking for work. The position pays $15 a month, with room and board." That was fair. Better than fair, actually. It was good wages for the work. She kept her face neutral. "That's acceptable. When can I start?" He looked at her. "You want to start before I've said you have the position. You haven't said I don't." He stood up, and the room rearranged itself slightly around the movement. He was that kind of man. Not commanding exactly, but present. He crossed to the stove and picked up a cloth and a small tin from the shelf above it. He set them on the table. "Let me look at your hands. Mr. Blackridge, 2 weeks. He turned to look at her. "I'll give you a 2-week trial. If you can manage this household better than it's currently managing itself, the position is permanent. If you can't, I'll pay you for the time and arrange transport back to town." He paused. "And you'll sit down and let me look at your hands, or none of the rest of it applies." Evelyn looked at him. She looked at the chair. She sat down. Her legs thanked her. He cleaned the scrape on her palm with a directness that was practical rather than gentle, not rough, but not soft either. The attention of someone who had dealt with injuries as a routine fact of working life and didn't sentimentalize them. He wrapped it with a strip of clean cloth from the tin. She watched him do it and tried to read him the way she read everything, for what he wasn't saying as much as what he was. He wasn't saying, "This is strange." He wasn't saying, "I don't know what to make of you." He wasn't saying, "I already know this is a mistake." Those were the things most people said with their faces when they looked at Evelyn Hart arriving somewhere unexpected and demanding to be taken seriously. Gideon Blackridge's face was saying something else, and she couldn't quite read what it was, and she found that more interesting than she would have liked. "Is there someone to show me the household?" she said when he'd tied off the bandage, "or do I figure it out as I go?" "There's a woman named Dora who helps in the kitchen 3 days a week. She'll be in tomorrow." He stood. "Tonight I'll show you around. I don't need to be shown the kitchen. I'll find my own way." He stopped, looked at her. "All right. Where's my room?" He showed her upstairs a room at the end of the hall, small but private, with a window that looked out over the south pasture. A bed, a chest, a washstand, a hook on the back of the door for coats. It was clean, not spotless, not recently cleaned for her arrival specifically, just regularly maintained, which told her something about the ranch's standards that a scrubbed-for-company room wouldn't have. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and left her to it. Evelyn stood in the room for a moment. Her feet were starting to hurt again, which meant the blood was returning, which meant the long walk hadn't done permanent damage. She sat on the edge of the bed and very slowly, very carefully, removed her left boot. The sock was damp. 3 of her toes on that foot had blisters. She sat there and looked at them, and thought about the 9 miles, and the trunk on the road, and the driver's face as he'd snapped the reins. She let herself feel the full weight of the day for about 60 seconds, which was the limit she allowed, for things she couldn't change. Then she put her boot back on, stood up, and went to find the household accounts. She found them in a small room off the main parlor that had probably been built as a sewing room, and repurposed at some point into something resembling an office. A desk, a filing cabinet, a lamp, and on the desk, a stack of ledger books that had the organized look of someone's good intentions followed by their gradual abandonment. The most recent ledger was opened in November. Evelyn sat down, pulled the lamp closer, and started reading. The accounts were not chaotic. That was the first thing she noted, and it was important. Chaotic accounts were the accounts of someone who didn't understand numbers, and these were not that. Someone had set this up carefully, had understood the categories and the logic, and had kept clean records for a long time. The irregularities she was seeing weren't sloppy, they were specific. She found the first one in September, a feed invoice from a company called Garrison Supplies for 42 bales of hay, at a cost that matched the delivery receipt. But a second receipt filed 2 pages later recorded the same delivery as 38 bales, 4 bales short. The difference was small enough to attribute to accounting error if you saw it in isolation. Evelyn turned pages. She wasn't seeing it in isolation. October had 3 similar discrepancies. Small ones, never more than 5 or 6 bales at a time, never more than a few dollars on any single transaction. But when she added them up across the period she'd just reviewed, she was looking at a consistent, systematic short delivery that had been running for at least 3 months. The ranch was paying for feed it wasn't receiving. In a normal autumn, that might not be noticed until the problem surfaced, but this was shaping up to be a hard winter. If the feed supply came up short when it was needed most, the cattle losses alone could cost the ranch thousands. She sat back and looked at the page in front of her. It was 11 o'clock at night. She was sitting in a borrowed office in a house she'd arrived at 6 hours ago, after walking 9 miles through a blizzard. Her right hand was bandaged, and her left foot had 3 blisters on it, and she had lost her trunk somewhere on the Sutter Creek Road. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper from the desk drawer, found a pencil, and started making notes. She was up before dawn. This was not remarkable. She'd been up before dawn most of her adult life, because in a working household, the first one up set the tone for the entire day. What was slightly more remarkable was that she'd been up before the ranch hands, a fact she established by being in the kitchen when the first of them came in at 5:40 and finding her with the stove already hot and coffee already made. The ranch hand was young mid-20s at most, rangy and tired-looking in the way of someone who'd worked a cold, late shift. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and stared. "Who are you?" he said. "Evelyn Hart." "I'm the new household manager." She handed him a mug. "What's your name?" He took the mug somewhat automatically. Noah Briggs." "Noah, do you take breakfast before or after morning chores?" "After, usually." "But we haven't had anyone who—" He stopped, reformulated. "After chores. But sometimes I come in early, then come in early. There'll be something." He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone encountering a new thing and not quite sure of its classification. Then he took his coffee and went back out into the cold morning. By the time 6 o'clock came and the bunkhouse was properly awake, Evelyn had established the following. The kitchen had supplies for a full breakfast, though they were organized in a way she was going to fix by end of day. There were 7 ranch hands, plus a foreman. The foreman's name was Carl Hewitt, and he appeared to operate on the assumption that no one in the main house concerned themselves with operations enough to be worth consulting, and Gideon Blackridge took his breakfast at 6:30, and had done so every day for as long as anyone currently employed could remember. She had all of this from Noah, who had come back in at 5 minutes to 6 with 2 other ranch hands, and proved unexpectedly talkative once he'd had half a mug of coffee. People often were, Evelyn had found, if you made the coffee strong and didn't ask direct questions, just left space for talking, and let them fill it. Gideon came down at 6:28. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, much the same way Noah had, with the same expression, but his version of it was more controlled. He was dressed for work, heavy jacket, hat already on, the settled look of a man who'd been awake for a while. "You're up early," he said. "The coffee's been ready since 5:15, she said. "I thought 7 ranch hands and a foreman probably needed feeding before the day started." She set a plate on the table. "Do you eat with the men or separately?" "Separately, usually. Tables set in the dining room if you prefer. Or here." He pulled out the chair at the kitchen table and sat down. Here she gave him his plate. Eggs, salt pork, biscuits she'd had time to make because the stove had been hot and she'd found the flour in the lard, and she'd made them many times before in many kitchens, and her hands knew the motion without thinking. She poured his coffee. He looked at the plate. He looked up at her. "Where did you find biscuits?" "I made them." Another pause. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't quite name. He picked up his fork. "Sit down. I have things to—" "Sit down, Miss Hart." She sat, poured herself a cup of coffee, because she'd earned it, and because she was practical about calories and warmth on cold mornings. "I want to ask you about something," he said, "and I want a straight answer." She waited. "Why did you come here? Not why did you need work, I understand that. Why here specifically?" He was watching her with a directness that some people would have found uncomfortable. She didn't find it uncomfortable. She found it clarifying. "There are households in Denver that would have paid better, or Kansas City if that's where you were. Why 9 miles in a blizzard to a cattle ranch in a valley most people in Denver haven't heard of? It was a fair question. The truthful answer was complicated. Because large ranches have complex needs, she said. Complex needs mean there's actually work to be done, rather than performing busyness to justify a salary. And because isolated operations tend to be understaffed, which means the household manager either does real work or everything falls apart. She paused. And because you'd placed the advertisement 3 times in the Denver paper over 2 months. Once you might find someone. Twice you're having trouble. 3 times means the position is genuinely difficult, and the previous applicants weren't up to it. Which means if I am up to it, there's more security in this job than in a domestic position that any capable woman could fill. Gideon Blackridge chewed his salt pork thoughtfully. You read old papers. I read everything I can find. He was quiet for a moment. The position is difficult, he said. The ranch is large. The household staff is minimal. The winters are hard. And he stopped. And she prompted. And I have a son. He's 8 years old. His mother died 3 years ago. He's not a difficult child. But he's a child, and this isn't an easy place for a child, and some of the people who've managed this household have found that he stopped again. He was a man, she was learning, who knew exactly where his sentences were going, and stopped them when they were heading toward things he didn't like to say out loud. Mr. Blackridge, she said, I understand the position includes responsibilities related to your son's household welfare. I understand that. I'm not going to treat a child like a complication. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down at his plate and continued eating. There's something else, she said. He looked up. She'd thought about when to say this. Last night, staring at those ledgers, she'd thought about the options. Say nothing and use the information to establish herself first. Say it now and risk being dismissed as someone who'd spent 6 hours reading private financial records. Or say it clearly and directly and see what his response told her. I went through the household accounts last night, she said. I hope that's acceptable. I needed to understand the operation's current state. She placed her notes on the table beside his plate. There are discrepancies in the feed invoices from Garrison Supplies. Consistent across at least 3 months. Small amounts, but they add up. And given the weather, he'd picked up the notes before she finished the sentence. She watched him read, watched the muscles in his jaw tighten, watched his eyes move through the numbers she'd laid out, the invoice amounts versus the delivery records, the running total of the shortfall, the pattern she'd traced across September, October, and November. When he looked up, his expression was flat in the specific way that people's expressions go flat when they're angry and controlling it. You found this last night, he said. Yes, your first night. I wasn't going to sleep well in a strange house anyway. The records were there. He set the notes down, looked at them. How much are we short going into winter? If the pattern holds, and if we have the winter the weather's currently suggesting, you're short enough to matter. Not enough to lose the herd outright, but enough to have to buy emergency feed at whatever price the market decides to charge in February. She paused. If someone is charging you for feed they're not delivering, they probably know exactly what that means for a cattle operation this size. The silence in the kitchen had a different weight now. I can fix it, she said. I need your permission to contact the supplier and request a full accounting, and I'd suggest we arrange for one of your men to physically count each delivery going forward. But the records piece, I can handle that. Gideon Blackridge looked at her across the kitchen table. He'd been awake a long time, she could tell, and something she'd just handed him was sitting heavier than the general weight of a ranching operation in a hard winter. You've been here one night, he said. Yes, and you've already found a problem that's been bleeding money out of this ranch for 3 months. The problem was in the records. I read records. He was quiet for a moment. All right, he said, send the letter. I'll have Carl count the next delivery. She stood up, collected her notes, and began to clear the plates. She met Caleb at 9 that morning. He appeared in the kitchen doorway while she was reorganizing the dry goods, a project she'd mentally scheduled for the end of the day, but moved up when she realized how much time would be lost every morning searching for things, and he stood there watching her with the particular stillness of a child who is assessing a new thing before committing to an opinion about it. He was small for 8, or maybe just slightly built, with his father's dark hair and eyes that were a lighter brown, more gold in certain light. He was wearing a flannel shirt that was on straight and boots that were properly tied, which told her he dressed himself and took some care about it, or that someone had instilled the habit firmly enough to stick. He had a smudge of something ink, maybe on his right hand. She set down the tin of baking powder she was holding. You must be Caleb. You're the new lady, he said. Not rudely, just factually. I'm Evelyn. I'm going to be managing the household. She went back to the shelves. What's on your hand? He looked at it. Ink. I was writing. Letters, numbers. Papa says I have to practice. Your father's right. She moved a tin of molasses to a lower shelf. Do you want some help with the numbers later? He considered this with the seriousness of someone who has been burned before by adult offers of help that turned out to mean something different than advertised. What kind of help? Whatever kind you need. I'm good at numbers. Pop is good at numbers too. Then you're very lucky. Two people who are good at numbers and willing to help you practice. He was quiet for a moment. The last lady who managed the house said she'd help me with my reading, but then she was always busy. Evelyn put down the flower she was holding and turned to look at him directly. Caleb, if I tell you I'll do something, I'll do it. And if something comes up and I can't do it at the time, I said, I'll tell you, and we'll find another time. She paused. That's what I can promise you. I can't promise I'll never be busy, because I will be. But I can promise to be straight with you about it. He looked at her. She could see him filing this away, evaluating it against some internal catalog of adult reliability. Okay, he said. He pushed off the doorframe. I have to finish my numbers now. Go finish your numbers. He disappeared. She heard his boots on the stairs, then the sound of a door above, and then nothing. She went back to the shelves. By the end of the day, the dry goods were organized by frequency of use and labeled in her clear handwriting. The letter to Garrison Supplies was written, requesting a full delivery accounting for the previous quarter, in language that was firm but not yet accusatory. Dora, who came in at 8 and regarded Evelyn with the wary respect of a person watching someone competent do competent things, had been brought into the supply reorganization plan and had offered, unprompted, 3 pieces of information about the household's seasonal patterns that Evelyn wrote into her mental map of the operation. At 7 that evening, when she brought the letter to Gideon to review before sending, he read it, made no changes, and signed it. He looked up. How is it going? He said. Not quite a question. Well enough for the first day. Dora says you reorganized the whole storeroom. The current organization wasted 10 minutes every morning. I had time. He was quiet for a moment. Caleb asked if you'd come see his numbers practice. She stopped. I'll go up in an hour. Something moved in Gideon Blackridge's expression that he didn't quite manage to contain before she saw it. Relief, maybe, or something adjacent to it, something a man feels when a problem he didn't know how to solve resolves itself from an unexpected direction. He folded the letter and didn't say anything else. She went to see Caleb's numbers. The boy showed her 3 pages of practice sums, some correct and some with errors that were logical errors rather than careless ones. He understood the operation. He'd just made a consistent mistake in his carrying method that once she showed him he got immediately, not the tentative getting of someone who's nodding to be polite, but the sharp click of genuine comprehension. That's it, he said, and worked the next problem with the correction applied, and got it right. That's it, she agreed. He looked up at her. He had his father's way of looking at people direct, measuring, not unkind. Are you going to stay, he asked. It was not a simple question, and they both understood that. I have a 2-week trial, she said. After that, it depends on how the work goes. The last 3 ladies didn't stay. I know, why are you different? She thought about the 9 miles, the trunk on the road, the bleeding hands and the 3 blisters and the way forward had felt, in that particular moment on that particular road, like the only sensible direction. I walked 9 miles in a blizzard to get here, she said. I'm not particularly interested in leaving. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his pencil and started the next problem. That was enough. 9 days into her trial, 2 things happened on the same afternoon. The first was that Carl Hewitt, the foreman, knocked on her office door and reported somewhat grudgingly, in the tone of a man admitting something he'd rather not, that the Garrison delivery that morning had come up 4 bales short. Again. She thanked him, made a note, and added it to the running record she was building. The second thing arrived on horseback, in the form of a man in a good coat and an expensive hat, who tied his horse at the porch post and knocked at the front door with the purposeful knock of someone who had arrived with a purpose and intended to see it through. He gave his name as Victor Hale. He asked to speak with Gideon Blackridge. Evelyn showed him into the parlor, went to find Gideon, and then, because she was the household manager, and the parlor needed to be checked on at reasonable intervals, found reasons to be moving between the hallway and the kitchen during the next 30 minutes, within hearing of the parlor door. What she heard made her go very still. Hale had papers. A mortgage document, he said, a legal claim on the Blackridge Ranch property executed by Gideon's late wife some years before her death. He spoke smoothly, with the practiced reasonableness of a man who had said these words before, who had refined the presentation, until it sounded like a regrettable but straightforward matter of settled law. She heard Gideon's voice, and it was controlled in the way that something under severe pressure is controlled. My wife never mortgaged this property. I understand this may come as a surprise, Hale said. These things are sometimes handled privately, without full disclosure. My wife did not mortgage this property. The control in his voice had an edge to it now. I want to see that document. A pause, pages moving. Evelyn had reached the kitchen. She stood at the counter, not making any movement, and listened. The parlor went quiet while Gideon read. Then, where does your company hold this claim? The Territorial Land Investment Company. We acquired the original note some years ago. The mortgage has been in arrears for some time, Mr. Blackridge. We've been patient, but get out of my house. Gideon's voice was not raised. That was what made it frightening. You'll hear from my attorney. More sounds, the door to the parlor. Hale's footsteps crossing the entry hall, then the front door, then nothing. Evelyn was already moving toward the hallway. She reached the parlor door to find Gideon standing in the middle of the room with a document in his hand, and an expression that she'd not yet seen on his face in 9 days. And it wasn't a good expression. It was the expression of a man who had just been handed something he couldn't immediately put in its right place, and who understood in some bone-deep way that the not placing of it was dangerous. He looked up. He saw her. He started to say something, probably something about privacy or the household manager's remit, and then he stopped, because she was looking at him with an expression that apparently communicated something useful. May I see that, she said. It's a private legal matter. It's a claim against this property, she said, which is the operational context I work within. You don't have to show me, but I'd like to see it. He held it out. She took it. She read it. She read it again. She turned it over, checked the reverse, turned back to the front. She was looking for something specific, and she found it not quickly. It took her 4 careful minutes of reading, but she found it. Here, she said. She crossed to the window for better light and held the document at the angle that made the relevant section clearest. The property description in this mortgage. It references the east boundary at Cedar Run Creek. That's right, Gideon said. He'd moved to stand beside her. That's the east boundary. What did it used to be called? A pause. He looked at her. What do you mean? Creek names change. Settlers rename them. Did Cedar Run Creek have a different name at the time this mortgage would have been executed? The silence stretched. She watched the information move through him. Halton Branch, he said. We called it Halton Branch until about 5 years ago. The county surveyor renamed it on the official maps when he came through. 5 years ago, she said. And this document is dated 7 years ago. He took the paper from her. He looked at the property description. His jaw tightened. The person who wrote this used the current name, she said. The name the creek hasn't been called for 5 years. 7 years ago, a legitimate mortgage document on this property would have said Halton Branch, not Cedar Run Creek. Gideon Blackridge looked at the document in his hands. When he looked up, something had cleared in his face, not relief, not yet, because the threat was still present, but clarity. The particular clarity of a man who understands what he's dealing with. It's not a debt, he said. It's not a debt, she said. It's a forgery. And whoever made it was not quite careful enough. He was quiet for a long moment. Someone isn't just trying to collect on a claim, she said. Someone is trying to take this ranch. The fire in the parlor hearth crackled. Outside, the wind pushed snow against the windows. Evelyn stood in the warm room with the cold document in her hand and felt the shape of the thing they were dealing with, still mostly hidden but present, like a structure glimpsed through a storm. She'd walked 9 miles to get here. She was not inclined to let someone take it. The document sat on Gideon's desk for the rest of that afternoon. He'd put it there himself, face down, like he couldn't stand looking at it, but couldn't bring himself to put it away either. Evelyn noticed this when she brought in the evening correspondence, 2 supply letters she'd drafted, and one from his attorney in Sutter Creek that had arrived with the afternoon mail. She set them on the corner of the desk and didn't comment on the turned-over document, but she noticed it the way she noticed everything in that house, cataloging it, filing it in the running account she kept of what Gideon Blackridge showed and what he didn't. He was a man who didn't show much. She'd established that in 9 days. He wasn't cold. She'd revised that early read quickly, because cold men don't sit on the kitchen floor helping an 8-year-old build a model of a cattle chute out of scrap wood, which she'd come around a corner to find him doing on day 3. But he was contained. He kept things inside the fence line until he decided what to do with them, and only then did he act. The Hale visit had put something inside the fence that he didn't yet know what to do with. She left the letters and went back to the kitchen. Dinner that night was quieter than usual. The ranch hands ate in the bunkhouse, so it was just Gideon and Caleb at the kitchen table, which had become the default. The dining room was too large and too formal for 2 people, and Gideon seemed to prefer the kitchen's practicality without ever having said so directly. Caleb talked about a horse named Pepper that Carl Hewitt had let him help brush down, talked about it with the detailed enthusiasm of a boy who had found something that mattered to him and wanted the adults in the room to understand the full significance of each particular detail. Gideon listened and asked questions, and Evelyn moved between the stove and the table and observed the thing between them, the specific, slightly closeness of a father and son who genuinely loved each other and had been alone together long enough that the shape of their relationship had calcified around the absence of a third person. She wasn't going to be that person. She was clear on this in her own mind. She was the household manager. But she asked Caleb about Pepper's coloring because she was curious, and he answered for 6 minutes straight. And when she glanced up, Gideon was watching her with an expression she'd learned not to try to interpret. After dinner, after Caleb was sent upstairs, Gideon stayed at the table with his coffee. His attorney sent a follow-up letter, he said already. Hale's attorney. He had the letter open in front of him, the one she'd brought earlier. They're giving me 30 days to respond to the claim before they file with the territorial court. That's fast, she said. Deliberately fast. If they file with the court, the whole thing becomes public record. Every land transaction within 50 miles involves some consideration of existing claims. It doesn't matter if the claim is fraudulent. He stopped. Looked at his coffee. It creates uncertainty. Uncertainty makes buyers cautious and creditors nervous. And if your creditors get nervous, the ranch runs on operating credit during the winter. Every cattle operation does. You don't have cash in January, you have cattle that will be cash in spring. He looked at her. If the bank starts asking questions about a pending legal claim on the property, the credit gets complicated, she said, or it disappears. She sat down across from him. She hadn't planned to. This was his kitchen and his problem, and she was 2 days from the end of her trial period, which felt like a strange time to be inserting herself into the financial strategy of a man's ranch. But she sat down. The document is forged, she said. We've established that. Your attorney needs to see the specific error, the creek name, and he needs to document the historical usage. County records, old survey maps, anything that establishes what that boundary was called 7 years ago. I know, he turned his coffee mug in his hands. I've got a meeting with Aldous Finch on Thursday. Aldous Finch. He's your attorney? Has been for 12 years. Is he good? Gideon looked at her. He's honest, which matters more than good. She thought about that. Do you know anything about the Territorial Land Investment Company? Who's behind it? I've been asking around since this afternoon. He paused. All I've gotten so far is that they've made claims on 3 other properties in the valley over the past year. 2 of those properties ended up selling, quickly, and for less than they were worth. The room was quiet except for the stove's settling sounds and the wind outside, which had dropped since morning but hadn't quit entirely. Someone's running a pattern, she said. Yes. And they need the legal mechanism to create enough uncertainty to drive the sale. Yes. She looked at the turned-over document on his desk, visible through the parlor doorway. Which means the forgery might not even need to hold up in court. It just needs to hold up long enough to make you desperate. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was even, but she could hear the effort in the evenness. My wife built this ranch with me. Not she wasn't a rancher, but she understood what it meant. She used to say Blackridge was the kind of place that changes a family's story for good if you hold on to it. He stopped. Someone put her name on a fraudulent document, forged her signature. Made it look like she'd secretly mortgaged everything she helped build. He looked up. I need to know who. We'll find out, Evelyn said. She hadn't meant to say we. It came out as a natural thing, and she didn't walk it back, because walking it back would have made it into a moment, and it wasn't a moment. It was just the truth of where they were standing. Her 2-week trial ended on a Thursday. Gideon told her at breakfast that the position was permanent if she wanted it, in the same tone he might have used to report a change in the weather forecast, matter of fact. No ceremony. She said she wanted it in the same tone. They agreed on a slight increase to the wage. That was the whole conversation. Noah Briggs found out from Dora and told the rest of the bunkhouse, and that evening 2 of the ranch hands named Pete Rollins and a wide-shouldered man, everyone called Socks, who had a real name Evelyn never successfully extracted, congratulated her while she was carrying firewood in from the porch, and Pete offered to carry the wood, and she let him because it was pragmatic, rather than because she needed the help. This distinction mattered to her, even though she didn't explain it. Caleb found out from his father and found Evelyn in the office and stood in the doorway for a moment. Papa said you're staying. That's right, good, he said, and left. She sat alone in the office and felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since the road in the blizzard, since the trunk left behind, since the driver's face as he'd snapped the reins. Not gone, that kind of tight didn't go away fast, but looser, more workable. She went back to the invoices. The Garrison supplies problem was more interesting the longer she looked at it, and not in a good way. She'd requested the full accounting, and it had arrived 3 days after her letter, which was fast enough to suggest they'd had it ready, which was itself a data point. The accounting was professional looking. Neat columns, clear dates, running totals. And if she'd been reading it as a standalone document, she'd have called it clean. But she wasn't reading it as a standalone document. She was reading it against the delivery records that Carl Hewitt had been keeping since she'd asked him to, and against the original invoices filed in the ranch's own ledgers, and against a thing she'd noticed on day 4. The invoices from Garrison had 2 sets of numbering, sequential numbers printed in the top right corner, and a separate reference code in smaller print near the bottom. Standard practice, possibly. Or possibly not. She cross-referenced the reference codes against the delivery dates. It took her a full afternoon and most of an evening, and at the end of it she had something she sat with for a long time before she was sure she was seeing it correctly. The short deliveries weren't random. They clustered. 3 or 4 in a row, then a clean delivery, then 3 or 4 short ones again. The pattern was too regular to be careless, and when she mapped it against the reference codes, she found that the short deliveries all carried reference codes from a specific series, a series that didn't appear in the full accounting Garrison had sent her, because that accounting used a different reference system entirely. Someone was running 2 sets of books. The invoices the ranch received were real invoices, from Garrison's legitimate operation. But there was a parallel system, the reference codes pointed to it, that tracked the short deliveries separately. The ranch was being billed through the main system. The missing feed was going somewhere else, tracked by the secondary system, and the money collected for it was presumably landing in a different pocket. She needed to know whose. She brought it to Gideon on a Friday evening. He looked at her work for a long time. Looked at it the way he'd looked at the feed numbers on her very first morning, with the focused attention of a man who understood what he was reading and was not enjoying understanding it. "This is more than a supplier cheating on deliveries," he said. "Yes. To run 2 sets of reference codes on that scale, you need someone inside the operation who knows the ranch's accounting system well enough to make sure the discrepancy doesn't show up in a casual review." "Yes. No one on my staff," reconsidered. "No one currently on my staff," she waited. "I let a man go in August," he said. "Ranch hand who'd been here for 4 years, Mason Rourke. He had some issues with following instructions. I gave him more chances than I probably should have because he was a good worker otherwise." He paused. He was in the main house twice doing repairs. He'd have had access to the office. Enough access to understand the invoicing system? It's not complicated. Anyone who spent 20 minutes with those ledgers. He looked at her with something that might have been uncomfortable acknowledgement. "You figured out the system in one night. I was looking for problems." He would have been looking for opportunities. She paused. He left in August. The short deliveries started in September. The weight of that settled between them. "Who else would need to be involved?" he said. "At Garrison? At minimum, someone who controls the delivery manifests. Probably someone with authority to adjust the billing records." She hesitated. "Garrison is a significant supplier for this region. If this scheme is running on other ranches, then there's real money in it." His jaw set. "And if the same people behind the Hale claim are also connected to Garrison's, they might be coordinating both pressures," she said. "Weaken the feed supply through the winter. File the fraudulent legal claim. Create enough financial stress and legal uncertainty that you're desperate to sell by spring." The fire cracked. Outside, an owl called once and went quiet. "I need to tell Finch about this," he said. He should know. "But Mr. Blackridge," she chose her next words carefully. "Before we take this to anyone official, I'd like another week with the records. What I have now is suggestive. I want it to be airtight." He looked at her. "Suggestive evidence makes claims," she said. "Airtight evidence makes cases." Another pause. She'd learned to be patient with his pauses. They weren't hesitation, they were thought, and thought was usually worth waiting for. "A week," he said. She told no one else. Not Dora, not Noah, not Carl Hewitt, who she'd developed a cautious professional respect for despite his initial wariness. She went through the records methodically, building the case the way you'd build anything that needed to hold weight from the foundation up, checking each layer before adding the next. On day 3 of the week, she found something she hadn't been looking for. It was in the oldest ledger, not the current year's records, but a ledger from 4 years back, which she'd pulled because she wanted to establish what the invoicing system looked like before the suspected tampering began. She was looking at the reference codes when a name in the margin caught her eye. A notation in handwriting she didn't recognize per VH Hold Ref. Series 7, VH. She sat with it for a moment, then she found the corresponding invoice date, cross-referenced it against the calendar she'd been building in her head, counted back. The notation was from a time when Mason Rourke had been employed at the ranch. But it was also, and this was the part she turned over carefully, not wanting to build too much on a set of initials from a period that predated Victor Hale's arrival with the mortgage document by 4 years, which meant either VH was a coincidence, or the scheme was older than it looked, or she was constructing connections out of fragments that didn't actually belong together. She wrote it down. She circled it. She labeled it possible and filed it with the other possibles and didn't say anything to Gideon yet. She was going to be sure before she said anything to Gideon. What she didn't expect was Caleb. He knocked on the office door on the 6th evening of her records week, at a time when she'd lost track of the hour and looked up to find it was past 8 and dark outside, and she'd skipped dinner without noticing. Papa said, "Come eat," Caleb said. He said, "You've been in there since noon." "Has it been that long?" Since noon, Caleb confirmed with the factual precision of a boy who paid attention to things. He made food. It's not very good, but he made it. She got up. Her back ached from the chair. She stretched it without dignity, which made Caleb grin briefly before he composed his face back to seriousness. They went down to the kitchen to find Gideon standing over a pot of something that smelled edible, if not exactly inspired beans, salt pork, cornbread, that had gone slightly flat on one side. He looked up when they came in. "I found Dora's recipe," he said, with the tone of someone who had found Dora's recipe and followed it approximately. "It smells good," Evelyn said. He gave her a look that suggested he understood what she was doing and found it mildly appreciated. It's beans they ate. The cornbread was flat, but not bad, and the beans were fine, and Caleb was full of information about a geography lesson he'd been working through from one of the textbooks she'd located in the parlor bookshelf and given him 2 weeks ago, which he'd apparently decided to approach with methodical intensity. He had opinions about rivers, as it turned out, about which ones were important and which ones the textbook was undervaluing. "The textbook barely mentions the Platte," he said, with the weight of a serious grievance. "The Platte is important." "The Platte is important," Gideon agreed. "Why do you think it's important?" Evelyn asked. Caleb looked at her with slightly surprised pleasure, the look of a child who has asked a question expecting a statement and received another question instead. He explained about westward movement and cattle drives and water rights, some of it accurate and some of it charmingly wrong, and she asked follow-up questions that let him build on what he knew correctly and discover on his own where his information went sideways, which was more useful than simply correcting him. When Caleb had been sent up to bed, Gideon stayed at the table. "You're good with him," he said. It wasn't quite easy to say, she could tell. It came out a little roughly, the way compliments come out of people who don't give them easily. "He's easy to be good with. He's genuinely curious. His mother was like that." A pause. Everything interested her. She'd read anything she could find. Half those books is in the parlor are hers. Evelyn thought of the geography textbook. "I suspected some of them were." He was quiet for a moment. "Then what are you finding?" "I'm not finished." "I know you're not finished. I'm asking what you're finding." She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them threw enough light to read by, and she'd learned to read Gideon Blackridge in the available light the set of his shoulders, where his eyes went when he was working through something. Tonight he was tired and trying not to show it, and there was something else, something that had been building over the past week since Hale's visit. Not fear exactly, something more operational than fear. The assessment of someone who understands the scale of what's coming at them and is calculating how to stand in front of it. She told him about the double reference codes. She told him about the pattern of clustered short deliveries. She told him about Mason Rourke's access and the timing of his departure. She held back the VH notation because she still wasn't sure enough. He listened to all of it. When she finished, he said, "How much of this can you put on paper in a way Finch can work with?" "Most of it. I need 2 more days, you have them." He paused. "I sent a letter to the county assessor's office today, asking for a copy of the survey maps from 8 to 10 years ago, to establish the creek name documentation." "Good." "That's exactly right," Finch suggested it. "Finch is good." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "I'll tell him you said so." She collected the dishes and brought them to the sink. The kitchen was warm and the wind outside was trying to work itself back up into something serious. She could hear it at the edges of the house, testing the caulking. "Miss Hart." His voice came from behind her, still at the table. She turned. He was looking at her with the direct, measuring look she'd come to expect from him. But tonight there was something else in it, not soft exactly, but unguarded, which for Gideon Blackridge was a significant distance from his usual presentation. "When you found the creek name error," he said, "on that first document, you'd been here 9 days. Yes, you didn't have to say anything. You could have sat on it, used it later as leverage, or simply waited to see what developed." "I'm not interested in leverage, I know." He paused. "That's what I'm saying." She looked at him for a moment. "I'm interested in the problem being solved correctly. That's what I came here to do." He nodded once, looked down at the table. "Good night, Miss Hart." "Good night, Mr. Blackridge." She went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the window, where the snow was starting again, soft and steady, not the brutal kind, just winter making its presence known. She thought about the notation in the margin. Per VH. She thought about the pattern she'd been building, piece by careful piece, and the way the pieces were starting to fit together in a shape that was both clearer and more troubling than she'd initially calculated. The feed operation and the land claim were not separate problems. She was increasingly certain of it. Two pressures designed to work together, timed to compound, the first draining the ranch's resilience through the winter, the second creating the legal mechanism to formalize the desperation. You didn't need to beat Gideon Blackridge head-on. You just needed to make the situation untenable from enough directions at once. And someone had put real thought into this, real time, real money. That was the part that kept her awake. She had her airtight case built by the following Wednesday. The full document ran to 11 pages in her precise handwriting, the invoice analysis, the delivery pattern, the double reference code system, the timeline of Mason Rourke's employment and departure, the specific discrepancies cross-referenced against the garrison accounting she'd been sent. She'd organized it clearly enough that a person with no familiarity with accounting could follow it, which was intentional. Courts weren't staffed with accountants. She brought it to Gideon at 7 in the morning. He read all 11 pages. It took him 40 minutes, and she used the 40 minutes to make breakfast, and check the household accounts for the week, and consult with Dora about the upcoming month's supply order, which needed to be placed before the next weather system came through, and potentially cut off the road for days. When he came into the kitchen, his face had that particular flatness again, anger controlled. "This is solid," he said. "It should be enough to establish the pattern to Finch's satisfaction. After that, it's his work. It's more than I expected. I told you I'd be thorough." He set the document on the corner of the table and picked up the coffee she'd left for him. "I found out something about the Territorial Land Investment Company yesterday, from a man in town whose brother-in-law works at the county records office." She waited. 3 of the properties they acquired in the last 2 years, the ones where the owners sold under pressure, they were all resold within 6 months, to a holding company called Cartwright Valley Properties. He paused. "Which isn't a real operational company. It's a paper structure. No offices, no staff listed in any directory, just a name on documents. Someone buying land through a front operation," she said. "A lot of land. And not small land. The 2 properties that sold, one was 400 acres. One was close to 600. He looked at her. "Blackridge is 1,200. The number sat between them. "Whoever is behind this wants significant land holdings in this valley," she said. "And they've built a system for acquiring it that operates through legal pressure rather than direct offer. Because a direct offer can be refused. Legal pressure creates a situation where selling looks like the rational choice. And if you refuse to sell under legal pressure, then the pressure gets worse," he said, "until the rational calculation changes." She looked at him. The arson risk. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind it. "That's a significant jump." "Is it?" "Feed fraud, fraudulent legal claim, front company acquiring properties at below market value. This is a careful, coordinated operation. If the legal pressure doesn't work on you, and you're not like the other property owners, you're financially stable enough to fight a court case, they'll need another lever." He was quiet. "I'm not trying to frighten you," she said. "I know." He set his coffee down. "I'm thinking." She let him think. "Carl," he said after a moment. "I need to talk to Carl about the security. The feed storage specifically," she said. "If someone wanted to hurt the ranch's position going into spring, the most direct method would be the feed." He was already standing. "I'll talk to Carl today." She nodded. He moved toward the back door, then stopped. "Miss Hart," she looked up. "The notation you found. The initials." He turned to look at her. "VH," she went still. "It's in the document," he said. "Page 9. You marked it possible." She had marked it possible. She'd included it because her standard was airtight, not selective, and excluding potentially relevant evidence because she wasn't certain of its interpretation, wasn't the same as being careful, it was the same as choosing. She'd noted it as possible and let him reach his own conclusion. "Victor Hale," he said. "It's 2 letters," she said. "It could be anyone, it could be." His voice was even. "But in context it's suggestive, which is why I marked it possible." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're careful." "I try to be. It's a good quality." He pulled his coat from the hook by the door. "It's also occasionally frustrating." The door closed behind him. She stood in the warm kitchen and heard his boots cross the porch and descend into the yard, and a moment later heard him call Carl Hewitt's name in the direction of the foreman's cabin. She poured herself coffee and went back to the accounts. The Thursday delivery from Garrison came up 4 bales short. Carl Hewitt counted them himself, twice, and brought her his tally in the early afternoon with an expression that had moved past grudging respect into something more complicated, the look of a man who'd decided a person had earned a certain standing without entirely being comfortable with how they'd earned it. She recorded the discrepancy, added it to the document. That evening, the first piece of luck they'd had came in the form of a letter from the county assessor's office, forwarded from Gideon's attorney. It contained a copy of the official survey map from 9 years ago, clearly labeled. The eastern boundary of the Blackridge Ranch property was marked, in the official handwriting of the surveyor, with the name Halton Branch. 7 years ago, when the fraudulent mortgage document claimed to have been executed, the official county record named that boundary Halton Branch. The mortgage document said Cedar Run Creek. No legitimate document could have used that name in that year because the county's own official record didn't use it. She held the survey map in her hands for a long moment. This was not impossible. This was not suggestive. This was the kind of evidence that didn't have another explanation. She brought it to Gideon. He looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. When he looked up, his expression was something she hadn't seen from him before. Not relief, not satisfaction, but something that went deeper than either. The expression of a man who'd been handed proof that the thing he knew was true was actually true, and who understood what it cost that he'd needed the proof at all. Her name is on a fake document, he said quietly. Margaret's name, I know. Someone sat down and forged her signature. Decided that was a useful tool. He set the map down carefully. She's been dead 3 years, she can't. He stopped. She deserved better than to have her name used like that. Evelyn didn't say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. She'd learned that Gideon Blackridge didn't need comfort, offered he needed space to hold what he was holding, and then he'd handle it. After a moment, he straightened. The controlled look came back. I'm meeting Finch tomorrow with everything we have. Will you come? She was startled, though she managed not to show it. You want me at the meeting? You built the case. You should present it. She thought about this. An attorney's office. A rancher and his household manager. The look Finch would give when he understood who had compiled the documentation, whether he'd receive it cleanly or let his assumptions get in the way. I'll come, she said. Good. He picked up the survey map and held it carefully like something that mattered. Let's take this apart from every direction before someone tries again. Outside, the wind had dropped. The night was still and cold, and full of the particular silence that deep snow creates, absorbing, muffling, making the world smaller. In the barn, the cattle moved and settled. In the bunkhouse, someone was playing a harmonica badly and stopping and starting over. Evelyn sat in the office after Gideon went upstairs, and she looked at her 11 pages of documentation, and she thought about the shape of the thing they were fighting. The feed fraud, the forged mortgage, the front company, the pattern of pressure applied from multiple directions. It was patient work, whoever had designed it. Careful work. The kind that assumed the target would make rational decisions under accumulated stress and had planned for those decisions in advance. She added another page to the document. Cross-references, timeline, the things that connected to each other and the things that might connect, but hadn't been proven yet. Her handwriting was steady as it always was. The lamp burned. She wrote until the cold got into the room, then banked the office fire and went upstairs. She passed Caleb's door and heard the quiet sound of deep sleep, a child's breathing, steady and uncomplicated. She went to her room. She stood at the window and looked out at the snow in the dark, and thought about the name VH in the margin of an old ledger, and about Cartwright Valley Properties, and about the patient, coordinated pressure being applied to a man who had built something worth building, and a boy who was sleeping peacefully because he didn't yet know how hard people were working to take it. She'd walked 9 miles to get here. Whatever was coming, she was not going to walk away from it. Aldous Finch was not what she'd expected. She'd built a picture of him from Context 12 years as Gideon's attorney, described as honest rather than brilliant, operating out of a small office in Sutter Creek. She'd expected someone cautious, methodical, possibly slightly past his prime. What she got was a compact man in his late 50s with sharp gray eyes and a habit of tapping one finger on the desk when he was thinking, which he did a great deal during the 2 hours they sat in his office on that Friday morning. He looked at her documentation for a long time before he said anything. Then he said, "Who compiled this, Miss Hart?" Gideon said. "My household manager." Finch looked up at her. She met his eyes without comment, waiting to see what he did with the information. Some men would have reset their assessment downward at that point, adjusted their tone to something more explanatory. Finch just looked at her for a moment, then looked back at the document. "The creek name discrepancy is the strongest point," he said. "This survey copy is exactly what we need." He turned a page. "The invoice analysis is thorough, unusually thorough." He glanced at her again briefly. "You cross-referenced the reference code series. The pattern was in the codes. Once I saw the first discrepancy, I had to follow it back. Most people wouldn't have known to look there. Most people weren't looking for what I was looking for." He made a sound that wasn't quite agreement, but was adjacent to it, and went back to reading. The finger tapped. She watched Gideon watching Finch, and she watched Gideon's shoulders carry the particular set of a man who has handed something over and is now in the difficult position of waiting for someone else's assessment. "The VH notation," Finch said. "It's marked possible," Evelyn said. "I don't have a confirmed connection. No." but in context. He set the document down and laced his fingers together on the desk. I've been asking questions about the Territorial Land Investment Company since Gideon contacted me last week. The company was registered in the territory 6 years ago. The registered agent is a law firm in the capital. But the ownership structure runs through a series of land-holding entities, and one of those entities. He paused, with the care of a man who understands the weight of what he's about to say. One of those entities has a principal named Harold Vance. Silence, H.V. Evelyn said, not V.H. No, but Harold Vance has a son. Finch looked at her. His name is Victor. The room rearranged itself slightly. Outside the office window, Sutter Creek was doing its regular Friday business wagons. Foot traffic, the sounds of a working town in winter. Inside, the three of them sat with this new shape of the thing. Victor Hale, Gideon said. The name had a different weight now. That's not his real name. I can't confirm that yet. I'm telling you what I've found so far. Finch was careful, precise. What I can tell you is that Harold Vance has significant financial interests in this valley, and that those interests align precisely with the properties that have come under pressure in the last 2 years. He wants the valley, Gideon said, not a question. He wants a specific corridor of it, from what I can determine. The 2 properties that sold under pressure both sit along the Sutter Creek waterway. Blackridge Ranch controls the largest remaining section of that corridor. Finch looked at Gideon directly. Water rights in a valley like this aren't abstract. They're the operational foundation of every cattle operation within 50 miles. Control the water corridor, you control the terms everyone else operates on. Evelyn had known the shape of the scheme was large. She told herself it was large, documented it as large, but hearing Finch lay it out in those terms made it land differently. This wasn't one man trying to acquire land. This was a strategy to control the valley's fundamental resource. He doesn't need to own everything, she said slowly. He just needs to own the right pieces. Correct, Finch looked at her, and Blackridge Ranch is the right piece. Gideon was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was level, but she could hear what was underneath it. What do? We file a formal fraud challenge to the mortgage claim. I'll prepare that by end of next week. Finch picked up the invoice analysis. The feed fraud, that's a separate matter for the sheriff's office, but I'd recommend filing that concurrently. Multiple points of attack on their operation from multiple directions. He paused. It also makes it harder for them to focus their response. Right now, they believe they control the timing. We want to change that. What about Mason Rourke? Evelyn said. If we can establish his connection to the invoice scheme with the documentation you've built, that's a criminal matter, which means the Sheriff Finch looked at the papers in his hand. This is solid enough to take to Calder Wynn. He's not a man who moves fast, but he's thorough, and he's not in anyone's pocket, which matters. When? Gideon said. Give me a week to prepare the fraud challenge properly. Then we move on all of it at once. The week that followed had a different quality than the weeks before it. Before, Evelyn had been building the case from a position of uncertainty, not knowing quite what she was building toward, following the evidence where it led. Now the structure was clear, and the work was preparation, which was a different kind of pressure. She refined the invoice documentation, organized the timeline, wrote a summary version of the evidence for the sheriff that assumed no familiarity with accounting. She did this alongside the regular household work, because the regular household work didn't pause for fraud investigations, and there were meals to plan and supplies to order, and Caleb's geography lessons to check, and the leak in the bunkhouse roof that had appeared after the last snow that she'd negotiated Carl Hewitt into addressing by Monday. Carl Hewitt had moved from wary tolerance of her into something that functioned like professional alliance. He didn't say much about it, but he came to her now when there were operational questions, instead of routing everything through Gideon, which was more efficient and which she thought he'd begun to understand. He wasn't a man who yielded ground easily, but he was a man who respected competence, and she'd given him consistent evidence of it. Noah Briggs remained the easiest of the ranch hands to read. He was 23, from somewhere in Kansas, and he'd come to Blackridge Ranch 2 seasons ago and showed every sign of staying indefinitely because he'd found the first place since leaving home that felt like it fit him. He was not complicated, but he was good. Good at his work, good with the other men, good with Caleb in the easy way of a young man who remembered being a boy without trying too hard to seem like he hadn't. Evelyn had a specific kind of regard for people who were straightforwardly good at things without making a performance of it. It was Noah who noticed on Tuesday afternoon that one of the outer pasture fences was down along the north section. He reported it to Carl, which was correct, and Carl reported it to Gideon, which was also correct, and Gideon went out with 2 men to assess it, which was what Gideon did. He went himself, always, rather than simply delegating and waiting for a report. Evelyn had noted this about him early and found it one of the things she respected most, because it was the habit of someone who understood that you couldn't manage what you couldn't see. The fence had been cut, not broken by weather or a stray animal pressing against it. Cut at 3 points cleanly, with something sharp. Gideon came back with that flat expression again. And he told her in the kitchen that evening, and she wrote it down in the record she'd been keeping of incidents. Because this was an incident, and incidents were evidence, and evidence was the only language that mattered in courts. They're escalating, she said. The fence line is near the north grazing. If cattle drift in this weather, how far did they drift? Carl found them all. This time he sat down heavily. The weight of it was accumulating on him. She could see not breaking him. Nothing about Gideon Blackridge had the character of something that broke under pressure, but it was accumulating. The way snow accumulates. You don't feel the weight of each individual flake, but eventually the roof answers for all of them. This time, she said quietly. Yes, she thought about the feed stores. She'd been thinking about them since her conversation with Gideon, the week before the calculated vulnerability of the operation. The points at which you could apply pressure and have it mean something by spring. The feed was the most obvious, which was why she'd suggested moving it, but the fences were the second layer. Drifting cattle in a January storm could mean losses that no amount of careful invoicing could recover. I want to suggest something, she said. He looked at her. The north pasture feed the hay we've been storing in the old barn. I want to move it. To where? The grain storage building behind the smokehouse. It's smaller, but it's solid, and it's closer to the main buildings where there's regular foot traffic. She paused. The old barn is visible from the road. It's isolated. If someone wanted to access it without being seen, it would be easier, he said. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. You think they'll go for the feed directly? I think they've graduated from financial pressure to property interference. The fence was a message, if the message doesn't produce the result they want. She chose her words carefully. The feed is the leverage point that actually matters. Lose enough of it in the wrong weather, and the cattle losses do their work for them. He looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't entirely read what was in it. She was better at reading him than she'd been on day one, but there were still registers of him that stayed below the surface. I'll have Carl move the feed tomorrow, he said. Tonight, she said. I'd move it tonight. Another pause. Then he stood up, picked up his coat, and went to find Carl Hewitt. She stayed in the kitchen and listened to the sounds of the ranch organizing itself in the dark voices, movement, the creak of wagon wheels on frozen ground. She put more wood in the stove and made coffee for the men who'd be working cold and brought it out to the porch herself, handing mugs down to Noah and Pete Rollins and two others whose names she'd learned in her first week. Noah took his with both hands and gave her a nod that had real gratitude in it. Pete said something about her being out in the cold that was clumsy and well-meant, and she told him to drink his coffee before it cooled. By 10 o'clock, the north pasture hay had been moved. The fire started at 2 in the morning. She woke to the smell of smoke before she heard anything her body knew the smell before her conscious mind caught up, and she was sitting upright in bed before she was fully awake, smelling it. Not smoke from the house stoves, but something larger. Outdoor smoke, the kind that came from something burning that was not supposed to be burning. She was dressed and out the door in under 3 minutes. The hallway was dark, no indication the smoke had reached the house, and she went to Caleb's door, first pushed it open, found him sleeping, pulled it closed. Then down the stairs into the front door. The old barn was on fire. Not the careful, accidental fire of a kicked-over lamp. It was burning in 3 places along the base. Even from the porch she could see the separate origins, see the way the flames spread outward from each point rather than from one source. Set fire, deliberately. The bunkhouse was already moving. She could hear shouting, the sound of men coming awake fast. Gideon was on the porch ahead of her. She hadn't heard him come down, and he was already in his coat, already looking at the barn, with the focused assessment of a man, calculating what was in it and what could be saved. The feed's not there, she said. He looked at her. In the orange light, she could see the understanding move through his face, the relief and the colder, harder thing beneath the relief. They didn't know we moved it, he said. No. The ranch hands were running toward the barn with buckets. Carl Hewitt was organizing them with short, sharp instructions, not panicking. Carl Hewitt was not a man who panicked, but his voice had the edge of someone working at the margin of what could be controlled. The fire was substantial. The old barn was dry timber, and it was going. Evelyn turned back toward the house. Miss Hart. Gideon's voice stopped her. She started again. I need to check Caleb. Go, she went, inside up the stairs to Caleb's room. She opened the door and found him standing in the middle of his room in his nightshirt, having woken to the noise, his face white and eyes very wide. There's a fire in the old barn, she said, before he could catastrophize in the direction his face was pointing. Everyone is safe. The men are taking care of it. Your father is outside. Is Papa? He's fine. He's outside organizing. He's fine. She came into the room and crouched down to his level. I need you to stay in the house, not on the porch inside. Can you do that? He nodded. He was frightened and trying to hold it together, and she could see him making the effort a kid who'd already lost one parent and was doing the math on what fire meant. "He's fine," she said again firmly. "I promise you." She stood, and then she heard it shouting from outside, different from the organized shouting of firefighting, something sharper and worse. "Stay here," she told Caleb and went back out. The south wall of the barn had collapsed faster than anyone had expected. She heard it as she came down the stairs, a sound like the world dropping, and she heard Carl Hewitt shout a name. Noah. She reached the front door and pushed through it and saw, in the terrible light of the burning barn, the thing that had happened. The south wall had come down, and Noah Briggs had been working too close to it with a bucket line, and the collapse had driven him back into the interior gap where the wall met the ground, and the gap was already filling with smoke, and the rest of the wall was unstable. Carl was at the edge of the firelight, gesturing the other men back, not from cowardice, from sense, because a second collapse would take more of them. He was calling Noah's name. Noah was not answering. Gideon was already moving. She was already moving. She'd covered 20 yards before she knew she'd made the decision, and she was aware, somewhere in the back of her mind, that this was not a rational decision, that rational decisions did not involve running toward burning barns. But Noah Briggs was 23 years old, and he'd handed her a coffee mug on her first morning and told her about the ranch in the frank, uncomplicated way of someone who trusted easily, and she was not going to stand on the porch and watch the firelight. She reached the gap a step behind Gideon. The smoke was dense and immediate and terrible, and she could hear Carl Hewitt shouting behind them. The interior of the gap was maybe 8 feet deep, low-ceilinged, lit by the fire through the remaining structure in a way that was more confusing than illuminating. She dropped lower, below the worst of the smoke, and she heard Noah coughing close, somewhere to the left. Noah. Gideon's voice controlled, cutting through. "Shout." Noah shouted a cough that was mostly a shout to her left, 10 feet maybe. She went left, and Gideon went left, and she found Noah's arm in the smoke and grabbed it and pulled. He was dazed but moving, not unconscious, his legs working even if his mind was somewhere behind his eyes. She got under one arm and felt Gideon take the other, and they moved. The second collapse happened behind them as they cleared the gap. She felt it in the air more than heard it, a pressure, a wave of heat and sound and debris, and she went down on one knee from the force of it but held onto Noah's arm, and then they were out, and Carl Hewitt and Pete Rollins were there, taking Noah's weight, pulling them clear. She sat on the frozen ground and coughed. Her lungs felt scraped. There was a burn on her left forearm, not severe, she'd feel it properly later, she knew. But right now her body was still running on something faster than pain. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and coughed again and looked up. Gideon was crouched beside her. His face in the firelight was different, stripped of the usual control, something raw and present in it. He had his hand on her shoulder, not gently, exactly, like he needed to know she was solid. "Are you hurt?" he said. "I'm fine." She pushed herself upright. "Noah, Carl has him." He didn't take his hand off her shoulder. "Evelyn." She turned and looked at him. He almost never used her first name. In 6 weeks at the ranch, he had said it maybe 3 times, and always in moments that broke through the professional distance. "I'm all right," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, then stood, pulling her up with him, and they walked to where Carl had Noah sitting on the ground, well clear of the structure. Noah was coughing steadily and had a gash on his forehead from the debris, and his face was black with smoke, but he was breathing, and he was present. His eyes tracked, and his voice worked when he tried it, though what he said was mostly incoherent. "Get him inside," Gideon said to Carl. "Get Dora if she can be reached, she knows basic medicine." Carl nodded and gestured to Pete, and they got Noah between them. The barn was gone. The fire was still going, but there was nothing structural left to save it. It was burning itself down to its foundation, and the men had shifted to a defensive line, protecting the surrounding structures from the sparks. It would be controlled by morning. The damage was contained to the old barn, which was the old barn, not the feed store, not the main structures. Evelyn stood and watched it burn. Beside her, Gideon was quiet for a long time. "They knew where the feed was stored," he said finally, "where it used to be stored." "Yes. Which means they've been watching this property closely enough to have specific operational knowledge of it. Or someone told them." She paused. "Not someone currently on your staff, but someone with recent enough knowledge to know the old storage arrangement." "Rourke," he said. His voice was flat. "He left in August. The arrangement hasn't changed until last night." She looked at the burning structure. "He told them where to hit. They assumed we hadn't changed anything." The fire crackled. A section of roofing collapsed inward, sending a column of sparks upward into the cold air, and she watched them rise and scatter and go dark. "They've escalated to arson," she said, "which means they're not willing to wait for the legal process. They want a result faster than the court can provide it. Or they wanted to destroy something specific. He was looking at the fire, the feed. If it had still been there, we'd be facing spring with insufficient feed, and a significant herd loss and a fraudulent legal claim all at once. She paused. It would have been enough. For most people, it would have been enough. He turned and looked at her. You moved the feed. You moved the feed, I suggested it. You suggested it at the right time. Something moved in his face. 2 nights ago, if we'd waited. He held her gaze. In the firelight, his face was open in a way she'd only seen a few times. In moments he didn't plan, when Caleb had shown him a corrected mathematics problem with genuine pride. When Finch had confirmed the survey map would hold up in court. The moments when the careful containment didn't quite hold. Thank you, he said. It came out roughly the way real things come out. Go check on Noah, she said. Sheriff Calder Wynn arrived the following morning. He was a tall man, somewhere in his late 40s, with a weathered face and a measured way of moving. That was not slowness. It was the movement of someone who had learned that urgency and speed were not the same thing, and that the former often interfered with the latter. He walked the perimeter of the burned barn with Gideon and Carl Hewitt, crouching at intervals, looking at things without touching them. He asked questions that were short and specific, and listened to the answers with the same completeness. Evelyn brought coffee and was not invited into the initial conversation on the grounds that she was the household manager, and the conversation was happening outdoors in the wreckage of the barn. But she was in the kitchen when Gideon brought Wynn in afterward, and she was not asked to leave, which she took as acceptable. 3 ignition points, Wynn said, settling into a chair at the kitchen table with his coffee. Deliberate. Someone knew what they were doing. The spacing was calculated to bring the south wall down fast. He looked at Gideon, which means it wasn't someone who panicked or acted in the moment. This was planned. I know who planned it, Gideon said. Wynn's expression didn't change, but his attention sharpened. Tell me. Gideon told him the mortgage claim, the feed fraud, the Territorial Land Investment Company, the connection to Harold Vance, the VH notation in the old ledger. He was precise and sequential, which was not nothing, because men under pressure often aren't. Wynn listened. He didn't write anything down, which Evelyn found interesting. Either he had a very good memory, or he was reserving judgment about what was worth recording. When Gideon finished, Wynn said, You have documentation. My household manager compiled it. Wynn looked at her. She met his eyes. He had the same quality Finch had shown the brief assessment, the revision, the decision to receive the information on its merits. May I see it? He said. She brought the full document. He read it at the kitchen table over a second cup of coffee, with the finger-tapping focus she recognized from Finch's office. Though in Wynn's case, the tell was different. He moved his lips slightly when he hit a section that mattered, the unconscious habit of a man who had learned to read in circumstances where he had to work at it. He spent a long time on the invoice analysis. He turned back to it twice after reading past it. The reference code series, he said. Yes, she said. You're saying there's a parallel billing operation. I'm saying the evidence is consistent with that. Whether someone at Garrison is running it independently, or whether it's coordinated with the Vance operation. That's my part, he said, not dismissively. Clarifying jurisdiction. Yes, that's your part. He closed the document. He looked at Gideon. Mason Rourke, you let him go in August. I did. Where is he now? I don't know, I might. Wynn turned his coffee mug in his hands. There's a man been doing odd work around the valley since fall, staying at a boarding house in Millhaven, 20 miles east. Answers to Rourke's description, he paused. I'll pay him a visit. Will that be enough? Gideon said to hold him. If he's connected to arson, yes. That's not a minor matter. Wynn looked at the burned-out barn through the kitchen window. And it gives me a thread to pull on the broader operation. He stood. I'll need a formal statement from you about the dismissal, and I'll need Miss... He looked at her. Hart, she said. Miss Hart's documentation as official evidence. He looked at her. Are you prepared to testify to the methodology if this goes to court? Yes, she said. He nodded once, picked up his hat. I'll be in touch within the week. He moved toward the door, then stopped. One more thing. The boy who was in the barn, Noah Briggs. He's resting, Gideon said. He'll be all right. I'll want a statement from him, too, when he's able. Wynn paused. And he looked between them. Who pulled him out? We both went in, Gideon said. Wynn's expression moved almost imperceptibly toward something like approval. He put his hat on and left. The kitchen was quiet. The fire in the stove was steady. Through the window, the burned barn's foundation was a dark shape against the snow, still smoking lightly in the cold morning air. He'll find Rourke, Gideon said. He was looking out the window. Probably, and Rourke will lead somewhere. Probably, she said again. But Rourke is not the top of it. Rourke did the physical work, the scheme itself. I know. He turned away from the window. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen before, not the functional tired of a man who'd worked hard, but something deeper, the tired of someone who'd spent weeks holding a position against sustained pressure. Finch is filing the fraud challenge on Monday. Wynn is moving on Rourke. The evidence is in hand. He paused. How are we sitting on the feed? The shift back to operational was so fast it almost made her smile. We're sitting fine. The relocation worked. The winter stores are intact. The cattle on the north line. Carl moved them south yesterday after the fence incident. They're on the better pasture. He looked at her. You discussed that with Carl. I suggested it. Carl decided. Carl doesn't take suggestions from people he doesn't respect. I know. She began clearing the coffee things from the table. I've been working on that for 6 weeks. She heard him exhale something that was not quite a laugh, but was close to it, the sound of a person who finds something genuinely amusing in a moment when amusement is unexpected. She kept her back to him because she didn't want to make a thing of it. Noah's asking about you, he said. He wants to thank you. He can thank me when he's properly on his feet, not before. That's what Carl told him you'd say. She stopped. Carl said that? Apparently Carl has developed opinions about how you operate. She considered this and found it oddly satisfying in the way that evidence of being accurately understood always was. She set the mugs by the sink and turned back to the table. I'll go see Noah this afternoon, she said, when he's had some sleep. He'll be glad. Gideon picked up his hat. I'm going out to assess the fence repair. Carl's got 2 men on it. He moved toward the door. Miss Hart. Yes. He didn't turn around. He stood with his hand on the door, not quite looking at her, in the way of a man who has something to say, and is deciding whether the saying of it is worth what it costs. I keep thinking, he said, about the barn. What would have happened if we hadn't moved the feed? We did move it, I know, but I keep thinking about it. He was quiet for a moment. I should have thought to move it myself, long before you suggested it. You didn't know what I knew? No. A pause, but I should have been looking. She didn't have an easy answer for that, so she didn't manufacture one. You're looking now, she said. He opened the door and went out into the cold. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, listening to the sounds of the ranch going about its day a horse somewhere, the sound of voices, the specific creak of the porch under boots, Noah sleeping in the bunkhouse with a bandaged head, Carl, Hewitt, and 2 men repairing the north fence, Gideon walking out to meet them because he always went himself. Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway. He'd been in and out all morning, unable to settle, the way children are after a frightening night when the fright is officially over, but the body hasn't gotten the message yet. Is everything going to be okay? He asked. She looked at him. He was 8 years old, and he'd smelled the smoke and seen the firelight through his window and spent the night in his room knowing something was wrong and trusting the adults to handle it, which took a specific kind of courage even if children didn't name it that. We're going to make it okay, she said. That's different from okay just happening. We're working on it. He thought about this with his particular seriousness. That's more honest than what grown-ups usually say. I try to be honest with you, I know. He came into the kitchen and sat down at the table. Can I help? With something? She thought about what he could do that would matter without putting him in the middle of things he was too young to carry. I need to recheck the supply inventory against the order I'm placing this week. Do you want to help me count? His face did what it did when something engaged his interest, a small, precise brightening. I'm good at counting. I know you are. She dried her hands. Come on then. He followed her to the storeroom and she handed him the pencil, and they counted together in the quiet, ordinary way of 2 people doing a necessary task. And outside the window the snow was starting again, soft and steady, covering the burned ground and the repaired fence and the long road back to whatever came next. Calder Wynne found Mason Rourke on a Wednesday. He didn't announce it dramatically. He came to the ranch in the late afternoon, knocked at the front door, accepted coffee, and sat at the kitchen table and delivered the information in the same measured way. He did everything as a series of facts in the order they mattered. Rourke had been at the Millhaven boarding house, as Wynne had suspected. He'd been there since October, doing occasional labor for a freight operation outside of town, paying his board in cash. Wynne had gone with a deputy and found him in his room, and Rourke had made the specific mistake of a man who knows he has something to hide, but isn't quite disciplined enough to hide it completely. He'd kept records. Not organized records, not a ledger, but notes. Dates, quantities, initials. The kind of thing a man writes down when he's being paid by someone he doesn't entirely trust and wants insurance. As Wynne said, looking at Gideon across the table. It's in his notes 11 times. The kitchen went quiet except for the stove. Victor Hale, Gideon said, or whoever Victor Hale is. Wynne set down his coffee. Rourke didn't know his real name. He says he was contacted in July, a month before you dismissed him, by a man who knew the ranch's operational details well enough to discuss the feed storage arrangement, the invoicing system, the seasonal supply schedule. He was offered money to begin altering the delivery records in cooperation with a contact at Garrison. He agreed, Gideon said. Not a question, he agreed. He says he needed the money, and he told himself it wasn't hurting anyone. Wynne's expression conveyed what he thought of that reasoning, without requiring him to editorialize. He was let go in August, possibly because you noticed something, or possibly because his contact decided having him off the property was operationally cleaner. I let him go because he stopped following instructions, Gideon said. I didn't connect it to anything else at the time. The contact at Garrison, Evelyn said. She'd been sitting at the end of the table listening. Do you have a name? A man named Dutton. He manages the delivery manifests. Wynne looked at her. Your reference code analysis put us directly on him. He's in custody, as of this morning. She received this without visible reaction, though something in her chest released slightly the tight, specific satisfaction of evidence doing what evidence is supposed to do. And Rourke, is he talking? He's talking considerably, Wynne said with a dryness that was the closest she'd seen him come to humor. He understands that arson is a different category of offense than invoice fraud. He wants to distinguish himself from the barn fire. Was he involved in it? He says no. He says he provided information about the property, the feed storage location, the barn layout, but the physical operation wasn't his. He says Veach, the contact, told him it was handled separately. Wynne paused. I believe him, actually. Not because he's honest, but because the arson shows a level of operational planning that's beyond what Rourke demonstrated in anything else. Someone else set the fire, Gideon said. Someone who knew exactly what they were doing and left very little behind. Wynne looked out the kitchen window at the burned foundation, still visible against the snow. I'm working on that. It'll take longer. Gideon leaned back in his chair. He was holding his coffee mug but not drinking from it, just holding it the way you hold something when you need something to do with your hands. What about Hale, Victor Hale? We don't have him yet. He's not at the address he gave for the mortgage filing. His attorney, the one who sent you the follow-up letter, claims he hasn't had direct contact with his client in 2 weeks. Wynne's jaw set slightly. I've contacted the Capitol about Harold Vance. That's a slower process. But you're moving, Evelyn said. I'm moving. He stood, picked up his hat. Finch's fraud challenge should file Monday. Once that's on record, Hale's claim is formally contested, which limits their options. He looked at Gideon. Hold your position. Don't sell. Don't negotiate. Don't respond to any further contact from Hale or his representatives without Finch present. You understand, I understand. Wynne nodded once and left. The burned barn yielded its secret 3 days later, when the debris had cooled enough to clear safely. It wasn't Evelyn who found it. It was Carl Hewitt, who was supervising the clearing with 2 ranch hands and who came to the house in the early afternoon with a look on his face she'd not seen before, not his usual carefully managed neutrality, but something that had gotten through it. He asked for Gideon. When Gideon came to the door, Carl held out something wrapped in a piece of burlap. Found it in the foundation debris, he said. Under what was the northwest corner post. Didn't know if it meant anything. It was a metal box, scorched but intact, the kind of box used for storing documents, with a simple latch that had warped in the heat but still functioned. Gideon took it, and Carl went back to the clearing crew, and Gideon stood on the porch for a moment looking at it. Evelyn was behind him. She didn't say anything. He brought it inside, set it on the kitchen table. Worked the latch with the careful patience of a man who understood the latch might not give twice if he forced it. It opened. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it from the worst of the heat, were several folded papers. Old papers, the fold lines had the settled look of documents that had been closed and kept for years. The edges were browned, but the ink was readable. Gideon unfolded the first one. Evelyn watched his face as he read it. He went very still. It's in Margaret's handwriting, he said. She waited. He read it through without speaking. Then he set it down on the table, and she could see, from where she stood, that it was a letter, a long one, several pages, dense with the specific handwriting of someone who was writing fast and completely. Not editing, not composing, just getting it down. She knew, he said. His voice had a quality she'd not heard in it before, not quite grief, not quite shock. Something that was both and was also something else. Something that was the experience of being fundamentally surprised by someone you'd thought you fully knew. She'd found the original scheme. Not the mortgage that came later, but the water rights. He looked up. She'd found documentation that someone was filing false easement claims against properties in the valley. 3 years before she died, she documented it. She hid the documentation. Why didn't she tell you? He was quiet for a long moment. She says, in here she was waiting until she had more. She didn't want to alarm me until she could show me the full picture. He paused. She died before she had more. The kitchen was very quiet. She found the original scheme, Evelyn said slowly. Before anyone else. Before it was sophisticated enough to include the mortgage forgery or the feed operation. She found the early version and documented it and put it somewhere safe. She looked at the scorched box. She put it in the barn because it was a permanent structure. Because if something happened to her, it would still be there. She didn't trust that she'd always be there to tell me herself. He said it flatly, but the flatness was the effort. not the feeling. She was protecting the ranch, even then, even before she was sick. Evelyn looked at the letter on the table and thought about Margaret Blackridge, whom she'd never met, who had sat at this same kitchen table or walked these same floors, who had loved this ranch and understood its vulnerability before anyone else did, and who had done the thing available to her documentation, evidenced the quiet work of building a record and then run out of time. She found what I found, Evelyn said quietly. 3 years earlier. Gideon looked at her. Yes. Then her work and mine together. She picked up the letter carefully, read the first page. If this establishes the original easement fraud, and my documentation establishes the current operation, and we can show they're the same scheme, that's not just a contested mortgage. That's a pattern of coordinated fraud spanning years. She set the letter down. That's what destroys it completely. He was watching her. You understand what she did. She did what made sense with what she had. Most people would have said I should have told him right away, regardless of how much she had. Most people aren't trying to protect something while they're still gathering the evidence to protect it. She paused. She was being careful. She wanted to be sure before she said anything. She heard her own words and recognized them, and she thought Gideon probably recognized them too, because something moved in his expression. She would have liked you, he said. It came out simply without decoration, which made it land harder than an elaborate thing would have. Evelyn looked at the letter on the table and didn't answer for a moment. Let's get this to Finch today, she said, before the Monday filing. This changes the document package significantly. Finch received them that same afternoon. He read Margaret's letter twice, with both hands flat on the desk, which was different from his usual tapping, and the difference meant something about how hard he was concentrating. This is extraordinary, he said. He didn't use the word loosely, she could tell. He meant it in the technical sense outside the ordinary, beyond what was expected. It establishes the scheme predates the mortgage forgery by years, Evelyn said, which means the fraud challenge isn't just contesting a document. It's exposing a long-running coordinated operation. And Mrs. Blackridge's documentation, Finch looked at Gideon. These easement claims she references. Do they correspond to the properties we know about? The ones that sold? One of them, yes, Gideon said. The names she mentions in the letter match 2 properties I know were sold under the Territorial Land Investment Company's pressure. Finch set the letter down. He was very quiet for a moment, which she'd learned meant he was assembling something in his mind. If I can match these easement claims to the county records, and if the records show the claims were falsified, then we have a direct evidentiary line from the original scheme to the current operations. He looked at Evelyn. Combined with your invoice analysis and Wynn's arrest of Rourke and Dutton, this is no longer a property dispute. This is a criminal conspiracy case with documentary evidence going back years. Which makes Harold Vance significantly more exposed, she said. Which makes Harold Vance significantly more exposed, Finch agreed. He filed the fraud challenge Monday morning. He did not file it as a simple contest of the mortgage document. He filed it with the full evidentiary package, the creek name discrepancy, the survey map, Margaret's letter, and the original easement documentation, Evelyn's invoice analysis, and a formal reference to Wynn's active criminal investigation of the connected operation. The filing was 43 pages. Gideon's attorney was not flashy, she reflected, but he was thorough, and thoroughness, applied at the right moment, had its own kind of force. The response came faster than she had expected. 4 days after the filing, Finch received a communication from the law firm that had registered the Territorial Land Investment Company. The language was formal and careful and said, beneath its formal carefulness, what these communications always said when a scheme encounters genuine exposure, they were reviewing the matter and anticipated a resolution. Finch told Gideon this meant they were looking for a way to withdraw that didn't admit liability. Gideon asked what Finch recommended. Finch said he recommended they wait and let the criminal investigation do its work, because a criminal case was a significantly more powerful motivator than a civil challenge. They waited. Wynn appeared at the ranch again on a Thursday 10 days after Rourke's arrest. He sat at the kitchen table again, accepted coffee again, and delivered information again in his sequential, unhurried way. The Capitol had responded to his inquiry about Harold Vance. Harold Vance was a land developer with significant holdings across 3 territories, a long legal history of boundary disputes, and 1 prior fraud allegation that had been settled without going to trial. He was not, it turned out, operating as Victor Hale, the name checked to a real person, an attorney who had been contracted to present the mortgage claim, and who was, upon being located and questioned, extremely eager to explain that he hadn't known. The document was fraudulent, and to provide every piece of correspondence he had with his client in exchange for consideration regarding his own exposure. That correspondence named Harold Vance directly. We have him, Gideon said. We have enough to make his position untenable. Wynne said, which was more careful but meant the same thing. The district attorney in the capital is involved now. This is larger than my jurisdiction, which is why it's taking the shape it's taking. He paused. The arson investigation. The man who set the fire. He looked at the table for a moment. I found him. He's a man named Cray who works on contract for a freight operation that's been linked to Vance's holdings. He made a mistake, bought lamp oil in Millhaven the day before the fire, paid in cash. But the merchant remembered him because he bought a specific quantity that wasn't a normal purchase. He paused. He's in custody in Millhaven as of yesterday. Evelyn sat very still. All of it, Gideon said. All of it is moving, Wynne said. The mortgage claim will be formally withdrawn. Finch will hear within the week, I expect. The criminal case will take longer, but the withdrawal of the claim is what matters immediately for your operations. He looked at Gideon. Your credit position. The bank's been asking questions. The bank's been asking questions since Hale first showed up. I've spoken to them. I've given them a summary of the investigation's status, which I don't normally do, but in this case the facts are the appropriate tool. He allowed himself the slight dry expression she'd come to recognize as his version of satisfaction. They're satisfied to extend your operating terms pending resolution. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. She watched him absorb it, all of it, the accumulated weight of 2 months of sustained pressure that was now slowly and imperfectly, and with more paperwork still ahead, beginning to lift. Miss Hart, Wynne said. She looked at him. The documentation you compiled. I want you to know the invoice analysis specifically. The district attorney's office called it the clearest evidentiary work they'd received from a non-legal source in their memory. He paused. I'm not sure what your background is, but you have a lawyer's mind for evidence. I have an accountant's mind for numbers, she said, and a housekeeper's habit of noticing what doesn't belong. He considered this. That's a useful combination. I've found it so. After Wynne left, the ranch was quiet in the specific way it gets when something that has been holding tension releases, not loud relief, not celebration, just the quiet of a system returning to a resting state. Carl Hewitt, when Gideon told him the update, nodded once and went back to what he'd been doing, which was as close to emotional expression as Carl got, and was, in its way, complete. Noah Briggs, who was back on his feet and working light duty with his bandaged head, heard it from Pete Rollins and came to find Evelyn in the office, and stood in the doorway. Is it true, he said. That Wynne got the man who set the fire. In custody in Millhaven as of yesterday, she said. He exhaled slowly. Good. He stood there for a moment, working toward something. I wanted to say about the barn. You and Mr. Blackridge coming in after me. I've been wanting to say something for 2 weeks, and I kept not knowing what to say. You don't need to say anything. I know I don't need to. I want to. He looked at the floor, then back at her. I've worked a lot of places, not always good places. He paused. This is a good place. You're part of why it's a good place now. She looked at him for a moment. 23 years old and earnest about it, not performing, just saying the thing he meant. Go finish your light duty, she said. And don't tell Carl I said that about the barn. He'll just worry more next time there's a dangerous situation. Noah grinned, actually grinned, the first time she'd seen his full grin, which transformed his whole face. Yes, ma'am, he said and left. She sat in the office for a moment. The accounts in front of her were the normal accounts, the weekly supply costs, the payroll, the February order she'd been building for the past week, the ordinary machinery of a working ranch. She picked up her pencil. The door opened. Gideon came in and sat in the chair across from her desk, which he rarely did. He usually stood in the doorway. He sat down and put his forearms on his knees and looked at her. Finch says the withdrawal should come within the week, he said. That's fast. He says when a criminal case is moving in parallel with a civil challenge, the civil side tends to resolve quickly. Less exposure if they withdraw than if they fight. He paused. The criminal case will run its course in the capital. Vance will answer for it, or he won't, depending on how good his lawyers are. But for this ranch, for the immediate position, it's over, she said. It's over. He said it as if he was testing whether the words were true. They seemed to satisfy him. I want to talk to you about something. She waited. Margaret's letter, he said. I've been thinking about it. About what she did finding the scheme, documenting it, hiding the documentation. He paused. She did it alone. She didn't tell me because she was trying to protect me from worry until she had more. And she died with the full picture still in her head. He looked at his hands. I didn't know she was carrying that. She was protecting the ranch, Evelyn said. And you, I know. But I keep thinking if she'd told me. If we'd been working on it together. He looked up. Maybe it wouldn't have mattered. The timing, the illness. None of that was about the scheme. But I keep thinking about the alone part of it. She understood what he was saying beneath what he was saying. You don't want to be working the problems alone, she said. He held her gaze. No, I don't. He paused, and I haven't been. These past 2 months. The office was quiet. Outside, the February light was doing what February light does in Colorado, flat and white and honest, illuminating things without sentiment. No, she said, you haven't. He nodded as if something had been confirmed. He stood up. He didn't say anything else, which was characteristic. He'd reached the edge of what he was prepared to say, and he was done. But something had shifted in the room, and they both knew it, and the knowing didn't require words. The supply order, he said, looking at the papers on her desk. I'll have it ready tomorrow. He went out. She looked at the order in front of her, at her own handwriting on the page, at the numbers that were now the numbers of a ranch with its credit restored and its fraudulent claim withdrawn and its feed stores intact going into the last hard weeks of winter. She picked up her pencil and kept working. The withdrawal came on a Friday. Finch sent a rider with the paperwork rather than waiting for the post, which told her something about how Finch felt, about the moment the letter arrived mid-morning. And Gideon read it at the kitchen table while the coffee was still hot. And when he set it down, his face had the quality of a man who has been braced for so long that the unbracings takes a moment to register physically. The Territorial Land Investment Company was formally withdrawing its mortgage claim against Blackridge Ranch. The legal language was careful and admitted nothing, which was expected. What mattered was the withdrawal itself, the document that no longer existed as a threat, the claim that was no longer pending, the uncertainty that had hung over every financial calculation since January and was now, on a Friday morning in late February, simply gone. Evelyn was in the doorway between the kitchen and the hallway. She'd heard the rider come up, had seen Gideon's face when he broke the seal. She stayed where she was while he read it, giving him the room that the moment needed. He looked up. It's done, he said. Yes, he looked back at the letter. There was something in his face. She didn't try to analyze too many things in it, layered and complicated. The relief and the anger underneath the relief, and beneath that something quieter and harder to name. She thought about what 2 months of sustained pressure does to a person. Not the dramatic moments, the fire, the arson, Rourke's arrest, but the daily weight of it. The lying awake at night calculating. The assessment every morning of what was still standing. She thought about the fact that it had been standing, that it was still standing. I'm going to tell Carl, Gideon said, and got up and went outside. She poured herself hot coffee and stood at the kitchen window and watched him cross the yard toward the barn where Carl was working. Watched the conversation, Carl listening, nodding, and then doing something she'd never seen him do, which was put one hand briefly on Gideon's shoulder. It lasted about 2 seconds. Then Carl went back to what he was doing, and Gideon stood in the yard in the February cold for a moment, alone, looking at the burned foundation of the old barn that was still visible under the latest snow. She watched him stand there. She understood what he was looking at, not the ruin, but what had been there before the ruin, and before that, the years of work that had built it, and before that, the decision that had started everything, the decision to build something permanent, the decision that had made the ranch worth stealing. She turned away from the window and went to start the supply order, because the supply order still needed to happen, and relief didn't pause the needs of a working ranch. Caleb found out at lunch. Gideon told him at the kitchen table, in the practical language he used with his son for difficult things, not simplified, not dramatized, just clear. The claim against the ranch had been withdrawn. The people responsible were being dealt with in court. The ranch was secure. Caleb listened with the particular seriousness he brought to things he understood were important. Then he said, was it because of Miss Hart's papers? Partly, Gideon said. Miss Hart's work was a significant part of it. Caleb looked at her across the table. I knew it would be, he said, with the calm certainty of someone reporting a fact rather than offering a compliment. You had more confidence than I did some days, she said. No, you didn't, he said. You were always going to figure it out. She looked at this 8-year-old boy who watched things with his father's precision and his own particular version of it, and she thought about what it meant to be seen clearly by someone who had no investment in seeing you as anything other than what you were. It was one of the cleaner experiences available, and rarer than it should be. Eat your lunch, she said. He ate his lunch. The news moved through Sutter Creek Valley the way news moves through small communities faster than any formal announcement could manage, arriving in various shapes depending on who was carrying it. Finch's filing had been public record, which meant the fraud challenge had been common knowledge for 2 weeks, and the withdrawal meant the resolution was also common knowledge within 48 hours. What surprised Evelyn was the response. She hadn't consciously expected anything, but if she'd been asked to predict, she'd have said people would note it and move on. Ranchers were practical people. A legal dispute resolved was a legal dispute resolved. Instead, on the Saturday after the withdrawal, a rancher named Burl Sadler rode in from the neighboring property to the east and sat with Gideon on the porch for an hour. She heard their voices from inside, not the words, just the cadence of 2 men talking seriously. When Sadler left, Gideon came in looking thoughtful. He got a letter, Gideon said, last fall, from Hale's operation. He thought it was a legitimate claim and started making preparations to sell. He was going to sell, Evelyn said. He didn't know it was fraudulent. He's been in a legal consultation for 3 months. Gideon sat down. When Finch's filing went public, he started asking questions. And now, he paused. His attorney believes the easement claim against his property is connected to the same operation, the same pattern. She set down what she was holding. Margaret's documentation, the original easement records she found. Finch has already been in contact with Sadler's attorney. How many others? He was quiet for a moment. Sadler thinks there are at least 2 more properties in the valley that received similar pressure last year. People who didn't know what they were looking at. He paused. People who didn't have someone willing to spend a night reading old ledgers. She heard what he meant under what he said. They need the documentation explained to them. Their attorneys do. Finch is coordinating. He looked at her. He wants to know if you'd be willing to walk through the methodology with the other attorneys. What you looked for, how you found the pattern, so they can look for the same thing in their clients' records. She thought about this. An accounting methodology, explained to attorneys, applied to a pattern across multiple properties. The kind of work that was specific and unglamorous, and would matter enormously to the people whose land depended on it. Yes, she said. I'll do it. The meeting with Finch and 2 other attorneys happened on a Tuesday, in Finch's office in Sutter Creek. Gideon drove her in and offered to wait, and she told him she'd find her own way back, which made him look at her with a slightly exasperated expression she'd come to find privately amusing. It's 4 miles, he said. I've walked further. In a blizzard. In inadequate boots. That's not a standard I'm asking you to repeat. She got in the wagon. The meeting lasted 3 hours. The 2 other attorneys, a younger man named Graves and an older woman named Delacroix, who had been practicing law in the valley for 20 years, and who regarded Evelyn with the immediate, assessing respect of someone who recognizes useful work, asked good questions. She walked them through the reference code analysis, the delivery pattern, the double accounting structure. She drew diagrams on paper when words weren't sufficient. She answered every question twice if it needed it. When she finished, Delacroix said, "Where did you learn to read financial records this way?" "Necessity," Evelyn said. "I've managed households for 10 years. When you're responsible for a budget and someone is short delivering or overcharging, you learn to find it or you lose the money. You've been doing fraud detection for a decade and calling it household management." Evelyn considered this. "I suppose that's accurate." Delacroix looked at her for a long moment and then looked at Finch, and something passed between them that Evelyn filed away without examining too closely. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. The valley was doing what it did in late February, still cold, still gray, but with a quality to the light that was different from January's light, a degree of softness that wasn't warmth yet, but was the memory of warmth, the country's slow acknowledgement that the worst was past. She looked at the road and thought about the question Delacroix had asked. Where did you learn? She thought about the years of practical education that didn't come with any documentation, the boarding house ledgers, the merchant family's accounts, the hotel supply records she'd reorganized at 22 because it was clearly necessary and no one else was doing it. The invisible work, the work that happened in the background of other people's operations and kept those operations from falling apart and was rarely named. She thought about Margaret Blackridge sitting somewhere in this same valley 3 years ago, reading records that told her something was wrong and doing what was available to her, documenting it, hiding the documentation somewhere it would survive if she didn't. The 2 of them had never met. They'd used the same method, looking at the same problem from 3 years apart, and together between the scorched metal box and the 11 pages of cross-referenced invoices they'd built something that held. There was something in that she didn't have precise words for. Not closure exactly. Something more like the satisfaction of a proof that completes the moment when the logic holds all the way through, and the answer is what it should be. March came in with a week of hard weather, followed by a week that was genuinely, provisionally warmer, the kind of warm that a Colorado rancher doesn't trust, but a Colorado rancher is glad to have. The cattle on the south pasture were doing well. The feed stores had come through the winter with enough margin that Carl Hewitt, delivering his weekly operational report, mentioned it without prompting, which was the closest Carl came to expressing relief. Harold Van Hance was indicted by the territorial grand jury on 12 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and criminal property interference. His attorneys were, as Finch had predicted, very good. The case would take a long time. But the indictment was on record. The Territorial Land Investment Company had been ordered to cease operations pending investigation, and Cartwright Valley Properties had been identified as a connected entity in the criminal filing, which meant every transaction it had ever made was now under scrutiny. The two properties that had sold under pressure, the ones whose owners had taken what looked like the rational option, were now part of a civil recovery case that Delacroix was building, with Finch co-counseling. It was a long road back for those families, but it was a road. Mason Rourke pled guilty to conspiracy charges and received a reduced sentence for his cooperation. Dutton, the Garrison Manifest manager, pled similarly. The man named Cray, who had set the fire, did not cooperate and did not receive a reduced sentence. Wynne reported this to Gideon at the ranch in April, with the even-toned satisfaction of a man who has seen the mechanism of consequence work correctly. The Garrison Supplies contract was terminated by the ranch in March. Evelyn had spent 2 weeks researching alternative suppliers before the termination, so the transition had no gap. The new supplier delivered their first load in full, counted by Carl Hewitt, and Carl had reported this to her in a tone that was as close to cheerful as Carl Hewitt apparently got. 42 bales, he said. Counted them twice. Good, she said. Counted them a third time, he said, just because she'd had to turn back to the accounts she was working on because something in her face was doing something she didn't want Carl to see. It was Noah who noticed first. She didn't know he'd noticed until he said something to Pete Rollins, and Pete said something to Dora, and Dora, who had no interest in maintaining anyone else's obliviousness about anything, came into the office on a Thursday morning in April and set a cup of coffee on the desk and said, without preamble, "Everyone can see it, you know." Evelyn looked up from the accounts. See what? Dora gave her the look of a woman who has been alive long enough to find deliberate ignorance mildly tiresome. The way he looks at you when you're not looking. The way you look at him when you think no one else is. She picked up her coffee. Been going on since February, Dora. I'm not saying anything beyond what's observable to anyone with functional eyes. She headed for the door. I'm just mentioning it so you're not the last to know. Evelyn sat alone in the office after Dora left and looked at the accounts. The numbers were clear. The accounts were in order. The household was running well. The ranch was stable. She had done the work she'd come to do, and done it more thoroughly than anyone had expected, including herself. She'd walked 9 miles in a blizzard because turning back was the worst option. That was all. That was all. It had ever been the simple, unromantic calculation of a woman who had looked at the available roads and chosen the one that went forward. Everything that followed had been work, evidence, patience, the slow building of something solid from what was available. She hadn't planned for the other thing. She didn't know what to do with the other thing, exactly, because the other thing didn't fit into the categories she'd organized her life around: practical, professional, sufficient unto itself. She'd made herself sufficient unto herself across 10 years of boarding houses and temporary positions and moved on employers. And she'd done it carefully because the alternative was needing something she might not get, and needing things you might not get was its own kind of risk. She looked at the window. April light, real light, now the kind that had warmth in it. She went back to the accounts. Gideon said it, on a Sunday evening in late April, standing on the porch after Caleb had gone to bed. He didn't build to it. He didn't preface it. He said it the way he said most things that mattered to him directly, after a long silence in which he'd clearly completed the internal work of deciding, and delivered it without ornamentation. I need to say something to you. She was standing at the porch railing. The evening was mild enough to be outside without a coat, the first such evening of the year. She could hear frogs in the low pasture, which meant the ground was thawing properly. All right, she said. When you knocked on this door in December, he said, I thought you were someone who needed a place to weather a hard situation. I gave you a trial because you'd walked 9 miles, and that seemed to indicate something. I didn't know what. She waited. I know what now. He came to stand beside her at the railing. Not close enough to impose, but close. You're the most capable person I've ever worked alongside. And you're honest in the way that some people are, where it's not a performance or a policy, it just is. You don't manage people. You deal with them straight. He paused. Caleb trusts you more than he's trusted anyone since his mother. That tells me more about a person than most things. She was looking at the pasture. She could feel him looking at her. I'm not going to dress this up as something complicated, he said. I want you to stay. Not as the household manager, or as that too if you want. The work is yours. But I want you to stay as my wife, if you want. I'm asking because I want it, not because I think it's the next logical step, or because it would be practical. It would actually complicate a number of things considerably. She turned and looked at him. In the April evening light, he was very much himself, the directness, the slight rough edge to everything he said, the quality of a man who had thought carefully and was now just saying the true thing. It wouldn't complicate the accounts, she said. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. No. You'd handle those regardless. I'd want to keep working, she said. Not as a role, as this is what I do, this is who I am. I'm not going to put it down because of a change in my household status. I know that. And I'm not a simple person to be with. I have opinions about operational efficiency that I will continue to have. I've noticed. And I'm not. She stopped. She looked at him and made herself say the real thing. I'm not easy. I don't know how to be easy. I've been taking care of myself for so long that I don't always know how to let someone else. She stopped. Again. I know, he said, not impatiently. Just he knew. She was quiet for a moment. The frogs were persistent in the low pasture. The evening was mild and real. You asked me once why I came here specifically, she said. Out of all the positions available, I remember. I told you it was practical. That large ranches have complex needs and isolated operations have real work. She paused. That was true. But the full answer, she looked at the dark pasture, the star-showing sky above the mountains. I'd had a week that was bad enough that I needed to believe forward was still the direction that made sense. The advertisement was there. The road was there, she paused. It turned out the road was right, he was quiet. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Yes, she said. Don't make me say it more than once. The corner of his mouth moved again, and this time it went all the way, and she saw what Gideon Blackridge's actual smile looked like, which was something she'd been curious about for 4 months, and which was not what she'd expected. It was younger than the rest of him, unguarded in the way that only a few things get through. She turned back to the railing because she needed a moment, and he let her have it, which was one of the things about him that had mattered from very early on. He understood the usefulness of moments. They were married in June, not a large affair. Caleb, who was told in April and received the information with the focused seriousness of someone reviewing a significant operational change, spent 2 weeks asking logistical questions. Where would she sleep? Would she still help with his mathematics? Would things be different in ways that would be bad different or good different? And when he'd received satisfactory answers to all of them, declared that it was a good plan. He then spent the remaining weeks until June asking how long until June with the impatient precision of a boy who had decided an event was worth anticipating and wanted it to arrive on schedule. The ceremony was in the yard, on a morning when the valley looked like itself, fully the mountains clear, the pastures green in the way they only are for about 6 weeks before the summer heat starts pulling at them. Finch was there. Wind came, which surprised her and pleased her in a way she didn't examine too closely. Dora wore her good dress and stood with her arms crossed in an expression of complete satisfaction, as though events unfolded precisely as she'd predicted they would, which to be fair they had. Noah Briggs cried briefly, and then looked at Pete Rollins as if daring him to mention it. Pete did not mention it. Carl Hewitt stood at the back and watched with the expression of a man who has decided something is right and finds the rightness satisfying without feeling the need to make a performance of the satisfaction. Caleb walked beside her to where Gideon was standing, which had been his own suggestion, and which he executed with the solemn pride of someone who understands the weight of a role. He stood straight. He didn't fidget. When she glanced down at him before the final steps, he glanced up at her, and his face had that quality she'd loved since the early kitchen mornings open, intelligent, choosing trust. She held his gaze for a moment. Then they kept walking. The summer was busy, in the way that a working ranch's summer always is, an operational tempo that started before dawn and didn't relent until dark, organized around the fundamental economics of cattle and hay and weather and market timing. Evelyn worked alongside it and in it, managing the household accounts that were now also, in some technical sense, the ranch accounts, because the distinction between the two had never really been as clear as the categories suggested. Feed supply, staff wages, equipment costs, the household's daily operations, it was all one ledger, really. And she kept it the way she kept everything, methodically, and with enough margin built in that the unexpected had room to land without breaking something. In July, Delacroix's civil recovery case achieved its first result. One of the families whose property had been sold under fraudulent pressure received a judgment that required Vance's holding company to compensate them for the below-market sale price. It wasn't everything they'd lost, it was never everything, but it was something. And something in this context meant the scheme had a cost that landed on the people who'd built it. Harold Vance's criminal trial was scheduled for the following year. His lawyers were working, as expected, to complicate the timeline. Evelyn had no illusions about the pace of it, but the indictment was real. The evidence was in the court's hands, and the documentation hers, and Margaret's before hers was part of the formal record now. It would be answered for eventually in whatever form the court decided. She stopped expecting clean endings. Life ran to complicated ones, and complicated was fine, was often better, because it meant the thing was real enough to have edges. One evening in August, she was working late in the office. The supply order for fall was complex. 2 new vendors to evaluate, pricing that needed careful comparison when Gideon appeared in the doorway. He was in from evening checks, still in his work coat, bringing the outdoor smell of a summer night into the lamplit room. He looked at her working and didn't say anything for a moment. "Come to bed," he said. "I need another 20 minutes. You said that 40 minutes ago. Then I need another 20 minutes from now." He came in and sat in the chair across the desk and watched her work. She was aware of him watching, and found this was still somewhat new, that it didn't irritate her. She'd spent enough years being sufficient unto herself that being watched had always felt like assessment. With Gideon it felt different. It felt like company. She finished the page she was on and set down her pencil. "The Evans vendor," she said. "Their pricing is better on hay, but their delivery terms are worse. I want to negotiate before we commit." "All right." Carl should be in the conversation. He has opinions about delivery schedules. Carl has opinions about everything. Carl's opinions are usually correct, which is why I'd like him in the conversation. He looked at her across the desk. "Did you tell Carl that?" "No. He'd be insufferable. He'd be insufferable for about a week, and then he'd get over it." She gathered the supply papers and stacked them. 20 minutes, she said. 22, he said. I counted. She looked up. He was watching her with that expression. She still didn't have a complete name for the one she'd seen first in February, when he'd said he'd not been working the problems alone, the one that had the depth of a man who had learned the hard way that some things are worth more than you can calculate in advance, and is still slightly surprised by the worth of them. She understood it, that expression, because she had her own version of it. She'd walked 9 miles in a blizzard toward an address in a newspaper advertisement, and what she'd found at the end of the road was not what she'd been looking for, and was also, in some way she couldn't have predicted or planned, exactly what the next part of her life needed to be. That was the thing nobody told you about the choices that matter. You don't usually know they matter when you make them. You're cold, and the road goes forward, and you walk. You read an old ledger because you can't sleep in a strange house. You say a true thing when a simpler thing would have been easier. You stay when staying is harder than going. And somewhere in the accumulation of those small, unsentimental choices, a life takes a shape you couldn't have designed from the outside. Not a perfect shape, not a story with clean edges. Just yours. Built from what you did with what you had. She stood up and turned off the lamp. "Come on," she said. They went upstairs together, past Caleb's door where the deep, uncomplicated breathing of a sleeping child came through the wood, past the window at the top of the stairs where the summer night was full of stars over the mountains, through the quiet house that was running well and would still be running well in the morning. She'd arrived at this door with bleeding hands and 3 blisters and no money and a set of carefully worded letters she'd written herself. She'd asked for work and been given a trial and earned the permanent position, and then, in the way of things that grow from honest foundations, earned more than that. Not because a wealthy man had rescued her. She'd never needed rescuing. Because she'd kept walking when the road was hard and done the work that was in front of her and been straight about who she was even when a more palatable version of herself would have been easier to present. And because, on the other side of all that, there was a man who had looked at who she actually was and wanted that, not a simplified version, not a manageable version, but the full complicated working reality of her. That was the thing worth having. Not the ranch, not the security, not the resolution of the fraud case or the winter survived or the evidence that had held up in court. Those were real, and they mattered, and she was glad for all of them. But the thing worth having was simpler and harder to name, the experience of being known, and staying, and finding that the knowing made staying feel like the only sensible direction, the same calculation it had always been. Forward was the road that made sense. She had walked it all the way home.